One of the Assembly members approached me this morning and asked who it was who had written the sustainability question because they felt it was incredibly well crafted. So I just wanted to reflect that back to you, that I think it was a collaborative effort, but the people involved in crafting that question, I think, should reflect on how well they have summarised the feeling and aspirations of the Assembly. I'd also like to take this opportunity to remind you that we are moving into the formal work of the Assembly today and tomorrow, and just to get you to refresh and revisit the conversational guidelines that we set out at the very beginning. It is incredibly important that our respectful dialogue is conducted in the way that we all agreed at the outset. I would also urge you to keep mobile phones to the breaks and lunch times because it is a bit of a distraction in the room. So if we can all sign up to that, that would be great. So yes, welcome back, Assembly members. Welcome. Hello. Welcome back to the facilitators on your table, who I think you will know by now are wearing the blue T-shirts. If the facilitators can just give a wave to everybody. Thank you. Well-kent faces. Next time I'm going to ask you maybe to do a little dance. Also I'd like to welcome the Secretariat into the room, if everybody could wave. I think we're all starting to get to know each other, but we are considering getting photographs of everybody up on the website so you can make sure you know who we are. I'd like to welcome the research team who are with us this morning over in the far corner there, and also the observers and media, if you can make yourselves known. Waving. Lovely, thank you. And also members of our stewarding group who have joined us this morning. Bit of a wave. Lovely. Okay, so just a quick reminder that we are live streaming this morning, and that within about an hour after this session ends, we'll be moving across to the auditorium. So until then, enjoy the discussions this morning, and I'm going to hand over to Kelly, who's going to give us some practical work before passing on to Chris and Alan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I'm just going to tell you about our first task for this morning, and hopefully it's one that you're becoming a bit familiar with. So in a moment, we're going to do a round of introductions at our table, and you're going to be staying with the same table for the full weekend. So this is the first weekend where we'll be staying with the table throughout. After those introductions, we are going to complete the first of 2 research questionnaires for this weekend. So again, we've done that the past 2 weekends, and we'll be doing it for the next 2 weekends. So we'll be doing that again. If you have any questions for the research team during that process, please do just raise a card or raise a hand at your table, and they will come over and help you. And then after the research, we're going to move on to the first session of the weekend, which is a situational report on constitutional options. And you might remember that Chris McCorkindale last night, who was at dinner, gave you a little bit of information ahead of doing that. But before we get into that, I just have a few reminders for you. So Kate mentioned this too, but the Code of Conduct and the Conversation Guidelines, I just want to touch on the Code of Conduct briefly. So in particular, and reflecting some concerns that members have raised, I just want to remind you about timekeeping. So please make sure that you're in the sessions on time. Not drinking alcohol during the session meetings. Not using your mobile phones whilst we're undertaking Assembly activities. And being considerate and respectful to other members throughout. So please do bear those things in mind as we're going on. Of course, if for personal reasons you need to take a call or something like that, if you could just step outside the room to do that, because of course, sometimes that does need to happen. Also, Kate has mentioned that the media are here today, and they will be looking to interview some members of the Assembly, which is something that we mentioned to you last night. If for any reason you have any concerns or any questions, please can you speak to a member of the Secretariat about that? They'll be really happy to talk to you. And just a reminder again that we are live streaming this weekend. And if you come to the front of the room at any point, proceedings are being live streamed. So of course, you're going to be captured and you will appear on the live stream. If you haven't consented to filming, then please let your table facilitator know if you have any concerns. But again, as mentioned, we will be revisiting consent this weekend, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that later in the morning. Otherwise, I think that's all the reminders for now. We'll get on with our introductions, our research questionnaires. Let us know if you have any questions, and I'll be back in a little while. Take care. Okay, everyone, thank you. So we are now going to have our first input of the day. And if you remember, the purpose of this is to update you on the constitutional options and positions of the parties following the UK general election. And to do that, I'm going to welcome back Chris McCorkindale from the University of Strathclyde. So Chris is going to give you an update on constitutional options and position of the parties following the election. We are then, after Chris has spoken, and I think you're speaking for around 15 minutes, going to invite Alan Renwick from the University College London Constitution Unit, so Alan's just over there, and also a member of the stewarding group, to join Chris for a question and answer session afterwards. And myself and Tim, who's just over there, will be roaming around the room with microphones to pick up the questions that you have. As Chris is speaking, like we do with all of our speakers, just think and reflect on some of the points that strike you and make a note of those points in whatever way is best for you. You might find it useful to refer back to any of those notes when you are asking questions to Chris and Alan, or when we're doing some further deliberation later in the day. So I do encourage you to just note in whatever way is best for you some of the points coming up. And as we've done previously, we're going to use the card system again for speakers. So just to remind you what the cards are. If you feel like Chris is speaking too quickly and you'd like him to slow down, please raise a yellow card, and he'll be looking out for that. If you want a point that Chris makes to be repeated or clarified or explained in a different way, please raise your red card, and Chris will respond to that. So yeah, I'm just going to hand over to Chris now, about 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that plenty of my students over the years have wanted to flash a red card at me, but probably for different reasons. So good morning, everyone. I just want to start by repeating something that I said last night, which was what a privilege it is to be here at the Citizens' Assembly and to play even a small part in helping you to conduct this amazing and unique exercise that you're doing, with a real opportunity to impact on the sort of Scotland that we want to build in the future. So thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation. The aim this morning is to do three things. One is to more or less refresh your memories in terms of what Nicola McEwen had covered with you in the first week about Scotland's constitutional position within the UK and beyond. Secondly, having since gone through a general election in December 2019, to reflect on what the constitutional implications are that arise from that election and the results that we saw there, especially with regard to Brexit and the re-emergence of independence back onto the political agenda. And then third, with Alan, to answer any questions that you might have about what I've said or about issues that I haven't covered that you think might be important. And I'll just say at this stage, I will be here across the weekend, so if you feel inhibited in any way about asking questions in front of the camera, in front of the crowd, I will remember to put my lanyard on, and you can grab me and just ask me any questions on a one-to-one basis throughout the weekend. So in weekend one then, I can't obviously cover in this time everything that Nicola went over, but some key points that I think are worth reminding you. The first point is Scotland has two parliaments and two governments. There is a Scottish Parliament and a Scottish Government based in Edinburgh that makes law and develops policy in devolved areas. And there is a UK Parliament and a UK Government in London which makes laws for Scotland in reserved areas, but which also retains the right also to legislate in devolved areas. So only the UK Parliament can legislate for Scotland in reserved areas. Both the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament can legislate for Scotland in devolved areas, although the Scottish Parliament will take the lead in those areas. Why do we have two parliaments for Scotland? Well, I would call this a tale of two referendums. First, in 1997 and 1998, with the establishment of the Scottish Parliament through a referendum and then the passage of the Scotland Act, where Scottish voters voted yes to the creation of a Scottish Parliament with limited tax-varying powers. That was a reaction to what was perceived to be a democratic deficit, whereby, let's say, Conservative governments could be returned to Westminster, could hold office in UK government, having been rejected at the ballot box in Scotland, which at that time would tend to return a majority of Labour MPs to seats in Scotland. So there was a political divide, a democratic deficit, or at least the perception of a democratic deficit that felt it had to be cured. And the way to do that was to give Scotland a devolved legislature, a parliament of its own, reflected in its own image in terms of how people vote. So we had two parliaments from that moment forward, from 1999 and the opening of the Scottish Parliament. In 2014, at the UK independence, the Scottish independence referendum, we rejected the opportunity to cast one of those parliaments aside in the name of independence and voted to remain in the UK. Okay? So there was an option to go it alone, to have a single parliament for Scotland, the Scottish Parliament as the centrepiece of an independent state. That vision was rejected, and we opted to remain in the United Kingdom and to remain with these two parliaments. Now, how, you might ask, do we operate in a system with two parliaments? How does this work, and what do we do when these parliaments, as is the case at the moment, are not particularly well aligned? Well, the Scotland Act, that's the piece of legislation that created the Scottish Parliament, created what's known as a reserved powers model of devolution. What that means is that everything is devolved, all policy areas are devolved, except those that are expressly reserved to Westminster. So the Scottish Parliament can do everything. It can legislate on any area, so long as that is a policy area that's not been expressly reserved to the Westminster Parliament at the UK level. And I'll say a wee bit more about that. That might include areas like defence as a reserved matter, the Constitution is a reserved matter, foreign affairs, immigration are reserved matters that the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate on. Whereas that leaves important policy areas such as health, such as justice, such as education, culture, tourism and sport that are to be legislated for by the Scottish Parliament. But the point is, this is seen to be a generous devolution of power. Everything is devolved except that which is reserved. And that can be contrasted with the Welsh model at that time. This has since changed, where everything was reserved except those areas that were expressly devolved to Wales. So we have had a fairly generous scheme of devolution in Scotland. But what about where there is conflict? I mean, we've said that the UK Parliament and the Scottish Parliament can legislate in devolved areas. We've said that these two parliaments are not closely aligned politically. An SNP government that's pro-independence and pro-Brexit, pro-EU, it's a sudden policy shift announced there, against a Conservative government at the UK level which is pro-Brexit and which is very much strongly for the Union and against independence. How can we resolve the differences when these two parliaments have different priorities for what might happen in devolved and in reserved areas? Well, we have political and legal rules that regulate that. The UK Parliament can legislate in devolved areas, but it can only do so, or there is a political rule that says that when it does so, it should seek the consent of the Scottish Parliament. So it retains the right to legislate in devolved areas, but it must seek the consent of the Scottish Parliament. It doesn't need to get the consent of the Scottish Parliament, as we've seen, but it must seek the consent of the Scottish Parliament before it does so. Now, that's a political rule. That means that it's not a legal rule, it's not a rule that's enforceable in the courts, and if the UK Parliament does legislate in devolved areas, the Supreme Court has said that this is a political rule, and therefore it cannot do anything about it. There is no legal means of stopping that. On the other hand, if the Scottish Parliament, by accident or design, legislates in a reserved area, then there is a hard legal rule to prevent that from happening. An act of the Scottish Parliament that legislates in a reserved area is not law and can be struck down by the court. So we have an asymmetry there. The political constraints the weak political constraints on the UK Parliament, the strong legal constraints on the Scottish Parliament. So what if the Scottish Parliament does want to expand the scope of devolution? Well, it needs the consent of the UK Parliament and or the UK Government. And as Nicola ran through with you, there has been a quite rapid, I mean, we're only 20 years into this thing, and there's already been rapid reforms to the way in which devolution is done, to the scope of the Parliament's powers. So we saw the Calman Commission, which produced which led to the Scotland Act 2012, and some transfer of competences, powers to the Scottish Parliament, most significantly around taxation and borrowing. We saw the Smith Commission in the aftermath of the independence referendum, which recommended a more serious, or more numerous anyway, transfer of competence and a much deeper and probably a more usable transfer of income tax powers and other tax powers. So we've seen over 20 years an increase in the scope of devolution. The Scottish Parliament has more powers, and a changing dynamic in devolution. The Scottish Parliament is no longer responsible only for spending money that is given to it by Westminster. It's responsible for raising that money and has to make different choices, difficult choices, about how much money to raise, where the tax level should be, where to prioritise the spending for that money, and to be held to account for that. So we're seeing a real changing political dynamic there. And then, I suppose the other thing to say is that that period of rapid change is not going to slow down anytime soon. We've seen, and we'll come to discuss, that independence is back on the agenda. If we have to fall short of independence, does that mean that we need to rethink radically what devolution looks like again? And do we need new powers to come to the Scottish Parliament to deal with the challenges that we're going to face after Brexit? So these are all very, very live issues. Now that leads me to the impact of the general election, where the Constitution sits after the general election. And I would say that there are really two main constitutional implications that I want to focus on. There are many constitutional implications, and maybe one of the most important of them is that after 3 years we finally have the restoration of governing institutions in Northern Ireland. But the ones I want to focus on are Brexit, the constitutional implications there, and independence and what it means for that to be back on the agenda. So the first question that I would maybe pose to you is, why is it that for the first time since 1923, voters were asked to get out of their beds on a cold, dark December morning to trod off to the ballot box and cast their vote? And the answer to that is pretty simple. The answer to that question, why we had a December general election, just 2 years after the previous general election, is Brexit. So before the general election, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, for some people against the odds, had secured a withdrawal agreement with the European Union. That's an agreement about the terms by which we will leave the EU. The problem was that with a minority government, he didn't have the votes that he needed in Parliament to turn that withdrawal agreement with the EU into a piece of UK law. He didn't have the votes in the House of Commons to do that with a minority government. So he gambled. He called a general election. He hoped that the Conservatives would make major gains in that election, that they would win a majority in that election, and that he would therefore have the votes that he needs to, in his words, get Brexit done. Okay? And I suppose part of the question that we're going to have is, they did win the election. They had a healthy majority of 80, the biggest Conservative majority since 1987, I think. And the first constitutional consequence of this is he has the votes to turn that withdrawal agreement into a piece of UK law. We are, unless there is a sizable, seismic shift between now and the end of this month, we will leave the European Union on the 31st of January 2020. It is on the immediate horizon. So the question that follows from that is, well, has Boris Johnson got Brexit done? And the answer to that is, sort of. Why do I say sort of, or why is that ambiguous? Well, on February the 1st, not much will change. Whether Big Ben bongs or not, when people wake up the next morning, the legal position, the constitutional position, won't have changed a great deal, at least in the way that influences people's lives. At the level of government and EU institutions, a great deal will change. We will continue to contribute, we won't have voice in the European Parliament. We will no longer send MEPs to the European Parliament. We won't have ministers, officials at high-level meetings where decisions are made. So it'll have an impact at that level. But what we will enter into is a transition period. From the 1st of February to the end of December 2020, we will be in a transition period out of the European Union. Why? Well, do we need a transition period? Because we need to negotiate the terms of exit. We need to negotiate a trade deal. What will our future trading relationship look like with the European Union? The EU would not negotiate that with a member state, so they had to wait until Brexit. They had to wait until the UK is out of the EU before they would enter into those negotiations. Therefore, we enter into an 11-month transition period where the UK, as a state independent of Europe, can negotiate that trade deal. Does that make some kind of sense? So what does this transition period mean? Well, as I said, we won't have voice. We won't be central to decision-making processes. But we will be subject to EU rules until the end of December. We will continue to be subject to decisions by the EU court until December. We will continue to contribute to the EU budget to December. And so for you, that means freedom of movement continues. If you want to go on holiday in the EU or work in the EU, it means the Erasmus scheme continues. If you want to study in the EU, it means that your businesses can continue to trade with the EU, within the EU, on the same terms the day after Brexit as they did the day before. How will that happen? Well, it's extremely difficult, experts tell us, that in 11 months, this extremely complex trade agreement can be reached. We have to secure borders, we have to build up infrastructure, we have to change immigration laws, we have to make difficult choices about, well, do we accept lower US standards to secure a trade deal there, but then does that mean that we lose access to the EU market because they won't accept goods with those lower standards? So we have to make all these difficult choices in a hurried context. And so it seems extremely unlikely that by the end of this transition period, we will have fully got past that transition and that there might be a further need to extend our continuing relationship with the European Union a little further still. Now, I've got 1 minute to cover independence, so that should be fine. A second impact of the general election was the resounding success of the SNP in terms of Scottish seats. The SNP won 48 out of 59 seats. That's 13 more than they won in 2017. And it's the third Westminster election in a row where there has been a majority of SNP, a pro-independence majority, elected to that chamber, or at least to the Scottish seats in that chamber, which, as I said, pitches a unionist, pro-Brexit UK government against a pro-independence, anti-Brexit majority in both the Scottish Parliament and in Westminster, and sets the scene for major constitutional disruption. Indeed, 1 week after the general election, the Scottish Government published a paper, Scotland's Right to Choose, which set out the democratic case for a second independence referendum to be held this year in 2020, before the end of that transition period. That case is based on 3 key claims. First of all, that the UK is a voluntary union of nations. That means that we are, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and England are here because we consent to be part of the UK, and the referendum offers us an opportunity to express or to revoke that consent. A second key claim, that the result of the 2014 referendum, when we voted to remain in the UK, has been overtaken by events, that Brexit is a material change to the context, and therefore it's appropriate to ask the people the question again, now that we know what our future relationship with the EU will be. And then third, that there is a democratic mandate in terms of majorities at Holyrood and at Westminster to re-ask the question. But one thing that's clear about this is that the Scottish Government is seeking, through this document, to have a negotiated referendum with the agreement of the United Kingdom Government and Parliament. There is no intention to declare independence unilaterally. There is no intention to legislate without the consent of the UK Government and Parliament. They want a negotiated way out. Why? 2 reasons. Legality. We'd said that the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate in reserved areas. The Constitution, the union between Scotland and England, is reserved. And it's an unsettled question whether a referendum that asks about the union is a reserved matter, the union between Scotland and England, or whether it is devolved, it somehow just falls below the level of that reservation. So they want to put the legality beyond doubt by getting the consent of the UK Parliament and government. Secondly, consent within. To be an effective independent state, we need to make sure that it's not just nationalists who are satisfied, but the unionists who remain part of that independent Scotland can consent to being part of it through a fair process in which their voice is heard. And international recognition. We cannot be an independent state without the recognition of other states, whose recognition will likely depend on the legality and the consensual nature of the process. Now, I'm well over my minute, but if I can just finish on a couple of quick points. First of all, on Tuesday, the Prime Minister responded to Scotland's right to choose with a firm answer, no. It was an answer that was short in detail, but which said that the 2014 referendum was a once-in-a-generation referendum and that he would hold the Scottish Government to that promise and would deny any future referendums. But that's unlikely to be the end of the constitutional question. Politically, it seems likely that the Scottish Government will place that rejection and Scotland's right to choose at the heart of its election campaign for Holyrood in 2021 to the Scottish Parliament. So that will be likely be an election dominated by the constitutional question. In the short term, there is a legal challenge pending where a crowd-funded group have sought the advice of counsel and will approach the court to ask them whether the Scottish Parliament already has the power to legislate for a referendum. And even if we fall short of independence, constitutional questions won't go away. And I'll say three things very quickly before the rugby tackle. One is, as Richard Leonard to my right here will discuss, are there options short of independence, but more than devolution that can be explored, such as home rule for Scotland within a federal UK? And I'll leave him to do more than that, because I don't think I'd be allowed to if I tried. Secondly, we'll have the return of powers from Brexit. Some areas and devolved areas, agriculture, environment, fisheries, are technically devolved, but we haven't had to do very much because they're exercised at the level of the EU. What constitutionally should happen when those powers return, and to what level of government will they return, has raised all sorts of interesting constitutional questions. And then third, in the face of Brexit, do we need more powers regardless of our constitutional future to tackle the challenges? Do we need powers over employment rights? Do we need powers over equalities? Do we need the room to set our own immigration policies? Because Scotland's needs post-Brexit will be different from that of the rest of the UK. So, has Brexit been done? Well, kinda. Is the Scottish constitutional question on the agenda? Is independence on the agenda? Well, kinda. There's a huge way to go, and that's why this forum is incredibly important, because you offer an opportunity to help us find our way through these extremely difficult political and legal challenges. So thanks very much.
Everybody, we now have up to 10 minutes for a Q&A with Chris and Alan. So if you make your way to the front, they're going to guide this session, and myself and Tim will just be roaming with mics to take your questions. So up to 10 minutes.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions. If it's a hard question, then it's for Alan.
The Scottish Parliament passed the Referendums Act, which was to put kind of in place the layout for making a new referendum. Where does that stand amongst what you were just talking about with the devolution and who decides what?
So what? Do you want to say? So what the Referendums Act does is it sets the framework by which referendums generally in Scotland will be conducted. So there is a legislative framework for UK-wide referendums, but this was a piece of legislation that sets a general framework by which any referendum in Scotland will be governed. So it's not specific to independence. When politicians were asked in Holyrood committees, can you think of any other referendums that are on the agenda other than independence, there was a kind of awkward silence. So it clearly is a nod towards an intention to hold an independence referendum. But it's not about that. And so if we do hold an independence referendum, part of the Referendums Act that was a result of a modification through the process is that we still need an act of the Scottish Parliament in order to create that referendum. And once it's created, it will be regulated by the Referendums Act, but we still need an act of the Scottish Parliament to generate the referendum. So the legal question doesn't go away. We still have to ask, is that Act of Parliament on an independence referendum within reserved matters and therefore not law, or out with it, or devolved and therefore something that can be done? The Scottish Government's really keen not to end up in court arguing about that, so it would prefer to have consent and then to use the Referendums Act as the framework under which that will be held. I hope that kind of answers your question. There's a question down here.
Hi, Chris. You were talking about Scotland having the powers with regards to fishing, and was that correct? Aye.
Well, what we're talking about are areas that are exercised, decision-making powers that are largely exercised at the EU level that will return.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, if Scotland had powers in regards to fishing and that, they wouldn't have a say in the UK government discussing foreign policy, would they, to the EU? I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, what is going to happen is there's a dispute about where these powers should come back to. Right? So everything is devolved except those areas that are reserved. And the Scottish Government and the Scottish Government makes the case that these things are done at EU level, they've not been reserved, therefore when they come back, they should automatically come back to the Scottish Parliament and we'll decide what happens from there. The UK Government's position is, well, when we framed devolution, no one really expected us not to be in the EU, and if we weren't in the EU, we would have kept these powers because it makes sense to have these things decided on a UK-wide level, other areas, agriculture and so on. So it's best that they come back to the UK, and then we'll decide what to do. Now, no one wants to pull these powers back to their level and jealously keep them. They then want to enter into common frameworks that will see the UK and Scottish governments and other devolved governments work together in these areas. So there will be opportunities for influence and dialogue and discussion. But what has been a site of contestation is who really controls that framework process. So there will be opportunities to input. I don't know if Alan's getting to add on the...
Just regarding the home rule and federalism option you were talking about, wouldn't that be decades in the making, because it would require consent and discussion in Wales and in Ireland as well, and given Irish reunification is also on the agenda now, doesn't that complicate things and make it pretty unlikely?
Okay. Richard? Well, I mean, I think that's a key point, is that when we get beyond the question of independence, whether that's to federalism or whether that's to more devolution, you get away from a self-contained Scottish question, because if we have more devolved powers, then the Welsh and the Northern Irish are quite entitled to look at the powers that we get and say, well, why not us? And there has been that kind of process of catch-up in Wales just now. They're looking at the powers that they have and saying, well, Scotland has powers over justice. Why can't we have powers over justice, right? So in terms of devolution, then you have to think about what are the knock-on effects for Wales and Northern Ireland. In terms of federalism, federalism would have to be based on a process of consent. And so you would have to seek that consent from Wales and Northern Ireland. Wales has always been less convinced by the merits of devolution. Would it be harder to achieve that consent in Wales as it was harder to achieve devolution in Wales? Perhaps. Would it be harder to achieve federalism with relation to Northern Ireland, given that we have, and Brexit has exacerbated the unique kind of constitutional relationship that Northern Ireland has both with the UK and with Ireland on the island entirely? I think you're right that this is not an easy fix. Now, it's something that's been suggested for as long as I can remember, and as long as people older than me can remember. But there are fundamental problems with it. Getting that consent is one of them. How do you have a federal system where we have kind of equal federations when one of those entities, England, has such a large population in relation to the rest, such a large share of the territory, in terms of the rest. You know, it creates a kind of imbalanced sort of system. So there are huge challenges that have to be overcome in order to make that reality.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Woo. Morning all. So it's interesting that some of the proposals that are being discussed by some of the parties, particularly down in Westminster, are kind of steps in the direction of federalism that wouldn't take you all the way there. So it's not a kind of all or nothing thing. So Labour has been talking about how you might replace the House of Lords with something that they call a Senate of the Nations and Regions. And actually there have been some hints from the government that they might be interested in reforming the House of Lords a little bit to move it in that direction. So there would be some kind of representation explicitly for Scotland and for Wales in Westminster. And that would be a kind of step in the direction of a federal system. As Nicola said during the first weekend, one of the features of a federal system is that the various parts of the overall union are represented formally at the centre. And changing the House of Lords in that kind of way would be kind of moving in that direction without going the whole way. So it's possible to make some steps, I think, without necessarily encountering all of the difficulties that Chris has described.
Question over here.
Yeah, and
Should the Supreme Court agree that Scotland can vote alone, does that mean that the UK government can't step in then and go against the Supreme Court's decision? Or can they still say that we can't?
Okay. There was a recent example that maybe illustrates this, which was the Scottish Parliament refused consent to the UK Parliament's what we call a continuity bill. This is a bill, a piece of legislation that says that the day after Brexit, the law will be the exact same. EU law will essentially apply, albeit as domestic law. It'll be converted into domestic law, but the same laws will apply the day after Brexit as before to ensure a smooth transition. And then we can unpick the bits of EU law that we don't like. Now, the Scottish Parliament refused consent to the UK's continuity bill, and in response to refusing consent, it legislated itself for a continuity bill. That bill was challenged in the Supreme Court, but it was challenged tactically, and here was the thing. The UK government didn't want a messy Brexit. It doesn't want the Scottish Parliament to legislate for its EU law continuity and then to have divergent regimes within the UK and the problems that would cause. But it was also a good argument to be made that what the Scottish Parliament planned to do was within the competence of the Parliament. So here's the trick that the UK government pulled. They have a procedure in the Scotland Act by which they can send legislation to the Supreme Court. If the UK government thinks, well, we are not sure that the Scottish Parliament has the power to do this, then at the end of the legislative process, the UK government can send it to the Supreme Court to ask the court to challenge that legislation before it becomes law. So what the UK government did is it referred this piece of legislation to the Supreme Court, and then during the time that it took for the Supreme Court to decide, because this process takes time, the government and the UK Parliament changed the law. They amended the Scotland Act so that the UK's own act was protected, and the Scottish Parliament, if it already had, would no longer have the power to change the law. So, or let me put that in much more simple terms. It's open to the UK government acting through the UK Parliament to legislate to amend the Scotland Act so as to take that out of the Scottish Parliament's competence, and therefore to make a defeat in the Supreme Court more inevitable.
But I think the question is maybe about a slightly different thing. So the UK government has just said that Scotland cannot have a referendum on independence. And there's been some suggestions that the UK government might be taken to court, and there might be an attempt to get the Supreme Court to overturn that decision. But I think the general view among lawyers, Chris is a lawyer, I'm not, is that they're unlikely to win that one. The UK government is on pretty strong grounds in saying that it has the right to say no to this referendum.
Okay, I did see 2 more hands up, so there's one here and one over there. We do only have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to take both of these, but of course there's going to be plenty more opportunity to speak to Chris and Alan throughout the weekend, so we'll take these last 2 questions and then move on.
Firstly, thank you for being so eloquent in describing what is a complex and difficult area, so I really appreciate that. My question is a very simple one, and thank you for your elucidating all the other aspects. But we have control of the environment in Scotland as a devolved matter, is that correct? The environment.
We do, and we have legislated in a climate change bill recently, but there are areas of this that will rest at the devolved.
The second part of that is, in the year of the coast, presumably our waters are also part of that environment. If we're able to legislate on land and in the air, one would argue that fisheries and waters are certainly a devolved matter. Thank you. I'd like your view.
I don't have a view at the minute, but I'll come and find you through the weekend, and we'll have a discussion about it.
You spoke about federalism, possibly changing the House of Lords. Would that then become an elected area, not say it is at the moment? So people will be elected into that House rather than what they are at the moment.
I think, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so there are 2 ways in which you could change the House of Lords so that it represented the nations and regions of the UK. One would be to have direct elections. So people from Scotland would elect some members of the House of Lords, people from Wales, people from the north of England, and so on. The other way would be to have representatives from the Scottish Parliament and from the Welsh Assembly and from other representative bodies in other parts of the country, that they would go and represent those parts of the country. So different countries around the world that are federal countries use those 2 different systems. So in the Senate in the United States, each state elects 2 senators, and those are directly elected by all the voters in each state. Whereas in Germany, for example, the upper house, which is called the Bundesrat, has representatives of each of the states, the governments from the states. So different people might advocate different forms of federal system.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to everybody for their questions. Thank you very much to Chris and Alan for their responses just there. As I mentioned before, Chris and Alan are going to be with us throughout the weekend, so you will have plenty of opportunity to continue asking some questions. So hopefully we'll have some fantastic discussions about what they've shared with us over the course of the weekend, which is a neat segue into what we're going to do now. So we're going to spend just about 10 minutes at our table absorbing a little bit of what we've just heard and sharing some initial reflections. And this is a space really just to share those reflections before we leave this room and then head into the lecture theatre for the political panel that is going to happen next. So we're just going to spend a little time absorbing what we've heard at our tables, and I'll let you know when we need to move. Soon.
Good morning again. Good morning. How are we doing? Good. Excellent. Good. Well, we're in a new location. It's slightly less citizens' assembly type of location, but great sound, great vision, and that's the important thing for this session, which could be really exciting. I know you're looking forward to it from some of the discussions last night. There's some interesting questions and some interesting ideas that you want to explore. We had a good discussion last night by way of intro, so I want to make this introduction quite short, but I want just to make sure that we know who our guests are, that we reinforce what the purpose of this session is, and then we get into the heart and into the meat of what we're trying to do. Remembering again that time is short, so we need to keep this as brisk as we can. So first of all, having said good morning and welcomed you all, let me welcome our guests. We've got Angela Constance on the far side, who is representing the Scottish National Party. Angela has been an MSP since 2007, representing Amman Valley and held a number of ministerial posts in the SNP government. Next to Angela, we've got Jamie Halker-Johnston, who's been an MSP since 2016.
17.
Is that right?
17.
17.
Yep.
Funny how Wikipedia says 2016. It's got it wrong, hasn't it?
Well, they don't believe everything you say.
You represent the Highlands and Islands, and I think you presently have a shadow minister role for jobs, employment and training.
That's right.
Jamie, good. Okay. Nearer to me, we've got Richard Leonard, who is the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. You've held that post for over 2 years, Richard, and you represent as an NSP Central Scotland. You've done that since 2006, 2017, 2016. Ah, you see, that's, I've misinterpreted it. And finally, in my immediate right, we have Lorna Slater, who is the recently elected, last August, I think, co-leader of the Scottish Green Party. And I think your partner in crime is somewhere at the back, Patrick Harvey, the other co-leader. So you're all very welcome. So just to remind you of the purpose of this, we're going to ask our guests to explore how you each see Scotland in light of the recent general election, and also, as we heard from Chris, the fact that Brexit is more or less certain to occur on the 31st of January, albeit with all the bits and pieces that still have to be sorted out. But what we want to do is to try to encourage you all, if you would, not simply to restate political partisan positions, as it were, but to explore the real needs of Scotland, the longer term interests of the Scottish people, and so far as you can, even though you have perhaps profound differences, to consider how we might work together. Constructive, forward-looking, how can we work together? The Assembly members are very keen that we do this in the mode of respectful dialogue. And I think what we are aware is that you have differences of view, and therefore you want to be frank and robust with each other and about the issues, but what we look for, I think, is civility and respect at the same time. And I was reminded this morning of the conversation and guidelines that you have for your activities, and one or two of them stand out for me. One person speaking at a time, everybody listening to each other, approaching it all with open minds, challenging your assumptions. That applies to all of us, as well as to our guests. Not grandstanding, that applies to us and to them. Be very careful with language, choice of words. And the last thing which I picked up was to be kind. And I suspect very often we miss that in politics and elsewhere. So kindness could lie at the heart even of this morning's discussions. So having said all of that, I think what I want to do now is to ask our guests to tell you a little bit about who they are, because you won't all know who they are. And they've drawn lots. And I'm just going to ask you for a couple of minutes to tell us, who are you, where are you from, and why did you get into politics? And Richard Leonard, we're going to start with you.
John, thank you very much indeed, and thanks to all of you for the sacrifices that you are making in this experimental, but I think pioneering project in democratic participation. So I thank you for your time. My entry to politics, well, I was brought up in a Labour voting, but not a necessarily Labour active family. So my parents were more of the Harold Wilson school, but I was excited by the ideas of people like Tony Benn. And so when I came to Scotland in 1980 to university in Stirling, and I've never left, I immediately joined the Labour Club and immediately became politically active. But that was spurred on by two things, especially at that time. One was that the university faced an over 30% cut in its financial allocation. But secondly, in the autumn of that year, the factory where my dad worked was closed down. And like lots of people in those days, there was a massive human cost of deindustrialisation. And in the case of my family, it meant that my dad and therefore my family had to move 400 miles away down to the south of England. So those things, I suppose, forge your outlook and help to shape the politics that you follow. And there were other things going on at that time. We had the miners' strike. I helped set up an anti-apartheid group in central Scotland and was involved in anti-racism work because there had been a rise in racism, especially in the late 70s and into the early 1980s. So all of these things were going around and helped me understand the world in a way that in many ways I still understand it. And I'm often criticised for not modernising my views, but I think your values remain constant. And I suppose to me, my principal values are those of cooperation, solidarity, and people sticking together.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks for keeping that succinct too. Angela, who are you, where are you from, and why did you go into politics?
Well, I'm a lassie from West Lothian. I have the great privilege of representing the constituency that I grew up in, I've represented Almond Valley since 2007. 2007 was a significant year for me. It was the first time an SNP parliamentarian had been elected to represent a West Lothian seat. And as well as becoming an MSP, I also became a mother that year as well. So there was a lot going on. And in terms of me representing my home constituency, that very much speaks to why I have an interest in politics and why I became politically involved. I grew up in a West Lothian mining village called Addywell in the 70s and the 80s. These were difficult times. They were difficult for my family. They were difficult for my community. My dad had a long period of unemployment, and there was a lot of consequences that arose from that. And I suppose in those formative years, I was against Thatcher, but very much for independence. And that's because I wanted to change. I wanted to change my life. I wanted to change my community, and I wanted to change my country. So that's what led me into politics. Prior to being a serving politician, I was a social worker and mental health officer. I worked in Scottish prisons. I also worked at the State Hospital at Carstairs. I was a local government councillor as well during those years. As John said, I've held several government positions, but I have now been liberated back to the back benches. And I have to tell you, I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying that sense of freedom. I suppose on a more serious note, being able to take that step back and, you know, just, I suppose, form more of a fresh perspective. It's also a big year for me. I'll be 50 this year, and I've got big plans, I'll tell you. And as an aside, I'm learning Arabic.
We could have a whole morning exploring just that, but we'll turn to Jamie. Jamie, what about you? Where are you from? Why are you in politics? Who are you?
Well, I certainly hope we're not going to have to talk about personal ambitions for this year, because I'm certainly not looking at learning any more languages at the moment. But I'm Jamie Harker-Johnson. I represent the Highlands and Islands. I come from a kind of a family that's always been very involved in local politics in Orkney. My grandfather and my father were convener of the local council. And my father's always been very, very involved in particularly local politics, as a Liberal Democrat, actually. So I'm somewhat the black sheep of the family, unfortunately, on that way. But I was never really involved in party politics until actually I got involved locally in Orkney. I mean, you know, community is so important in places like Orkney, your local parish, or you know, those around you. You very much look to each other to help each other, and that's something that's, I think, been very, very important to me. But I got involved, came and worked at the Parliament for a number of Highlands and Islands and MSPs, and then really kind of got involved in local politics then, stood a number of times unsuccessfully, and then was able to come in 2017. And you know, the thing I think we miss from politics is that probably all four of us here on the panel are in politics for the right reasons. We want to improve our communities. We want to look at areas where we can make you know, our communities and the lives of those people that live in them better. We just probably disagree on how we achieve that. But I totally echo, you know, the comments that you made earlier about language. Language in politics has become extremely unhelpful. One of the things I'll probably touch on maybe is social media and how that plays a role. But I think all of us probably want to get to a stage where we can have these conversations in a considered and positive manner, because I think that's when you get things done and that's when you get things achieved.
Thank you for saying that, Jamie. Lorna, finish off this round, if you would, and tell us about yourself and your journey and why you're here.
Very good. So I'm Lorna Slater. So I'm co-leader of the Scottish Green Party with Patrick Harvey, who's my fellow co-leader. So the Scottish Green Party is organised very much from the ground up, slightly different from other parties in the sense that Patrick and I don't tell the Greens what to do, they tell us what to do. So here I am attempting to represent to you, hopefully accurately, the sort of vision and values of the Scottish Green Party. Now, being co-leader is not a paid post. Patrick and I do that voluntarily. So Patrick, of course, is an MSP. That's how he makes his living. I have a day job. I'm an electromechanical engineer. I work for Orbital Marine Power, which designs and builds tidal turbines. So in that role, I'm very much on the sharp end of several of the sort of political issues of the day. One is re-energizing Scotland's manufacturing, repurposing our assets and our companies from oil and gas over to renewable energy. And the other side of that, maybe not so good, is that a lot of our supply chain, when we buy pieces for the turbine, we buy gearboxes, we buy generators and so on, all of that comes from Europe. So we're very much on the sharp end of how do we continue to do business, how do we continue to develop manufacturing in Scotland with sort of Brexit causing that uncertainty and getting in the way of what we do. I got into politics. I joined the Scottish Green Party 2 weeks after the Scottish independence referendum, when just about like everybody else did too. There was a sort of massive green surge where the party quadrupled in size in the matter of a couple of weeks. And for me, that was a question of, if not now, when? If not me, then who? It felt at that time like this amazing opportunity for change, for something different, for something new, had just slipped away. And I decided I wasn't going to let that slip away again, that I was going to get involved and get stuck in. And it's very typical of me to kind of throw myself in at the deep end. And I'd been a member only 3 months when I'd volunteered to manage a general election campaign and stood for Holyrood last time around. So it's been a very steep learning curve doing politics on the side while having a day job. And I'm very privileged now to be one of the party's spokespeople as co-leader here today.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Let's just pause for a moment and just reflect on what we've heard. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could spend more time with our politicians hearing about who they really are, what their lives are about, and just to have the conversation the way that we've had it so far. So it's just worth thinking about what might need to change to achieve that. However, this morning we're going to move on to more substantial and substantive matters. And what I want to do is just to set the context for all of you. I mean, the main questions that the Assembly is considering is how we see, how you see Scotland and the future of Scotland after the general election and in the context of Brexit. And I suppose what we're interested in here is how can we build a longer-term future in and for the people of Scotland in a sustainable way, and that's one of the topics that the Assembly has very much featured on. So I think I'm interested in asking you to tell the Assembly members how you see things, how we might move forward, even though we've got real differences, you've got real differences between you, and you've all mentioned this implicitly or explicitly, how might we work together, and what kind of Scotland are we seeking, are you seeking to see built? And there are obstacles, there are opportunities, there are priorities, there are challenges. So in 4 or 5 minutes, I would invite you all to address as much of that as you reasonably can, knowing that you can't cover everything. Lorna, I'm going to start with you in reverse order, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Over to you.
So we were asked to speak about in our brief what we think the challenges and priorities are for Scotland and what kind of country we think, the panel think, that we can build. So I'll be speaking, as I said, on behalf of the Scottish Green Party. The Scottish Greens are part of the worldwide Green movement. Every Green party in the world shares the same 4 values, and that's peace, equality, sustainability, and radical local democracy. So our vision for the future of Scotland is the same as our vision for the future of the world. We would like to see more of all 4 of those things. Specifically, the issue that I think has got to be the highest priority for all of us for the next 100 years for humanity is survival, is the climate crisis. We are at a situation where the rate of warming of our planet is, at the rate we're going, is going to exceed 6 degrees of warming, getting to 7 or 8 degrees of warming. As best we know, at 6 degrees of warming, 95% of life on Earth will be extinct. At 4 degrees of warming, most of our coastal cities are flooded. Glasgow certainly would be. In Edinburgh, we're flooded as far as Leith Links. That is predicted to happen in 2050. That's 30 years away. Today's climate strikers will be my age in 30 years. That's not that far away. So if we don't plan to do something about this, we have to plan to relocate all those homes and businesses. We talk about repurposing our assets, our quaysides, and so forth, and our vessels to renewable energy. That's going to be very difficult when they're 10 feet underwater. So I really want to focus our attention on that priority, which is a sort of existential one for humanity, but will affect, it will affect Scotland. At the moment, it's affecting people in Australia, it's affecting people in Yorkshire, it's affecting people in Angola, but it will start affecting us here more and more. So I want to keep that at the top of the list. And there are very practical things that we can do as a country to make this happen. None of this is impossible. It's absolutely doable. I don't want to paint a negative vision of the future. We can have a great future, but we have to plan for it, and we have to do certain very specific things. There needs to be significant public investment in things like public transportation. Buses and trains need to be cheap and reliable. The people of Scotland need to be able to get about to do their business, and we need to do so in a zero or low carbon way. That means stop investing in planes and cars, move that money, there's tons of money going into both of those things, move that money over to trains, cycling, and buses. Very straightforward, no new magical technology, simply a shift in priorities that we already have. We can do things like regional investment banks so that local areas can have some say in how they are developed. We don't like this centralized idea where someone in Edinburgh or London or Brussels or anywhere tells you what to do. People should have a say in what happens around them. We know, for example, that when people do have a say in what happens in their communities, they tend to make fairer, more sustainable decisions. Everyone can see how green spaces, woodlands, healthy water, healthy fish, healthy playgrounds benefit their communities. It's much easier to take away someone's playground from a distance by paper than it is to look someone in the eye and say, your child will no longer be able to play in that woodland because we're going to develop that into some flats. So having things local in communities makes a big difference. It's much easier to make fairer decisions when you can see around you the effects of the decisions that you're making. It's very easy to make decisions about things like fracking under somebody else's village. But if it's fracking under your own village, you'll feel differently about it. And the final kind of plank of the changes that I think are needed in Scotland is to really rethink how we use land in Scotland. And that is both to make it more economic, get more economic benefit from it, but also to use it for, using a technical term here, carbon sequestration. But essentially it means having healthy land, healthy trees, more forestry, healthy woodlands, healthy wetlands. All of those things are not only lovely for us to live in and to explore, but they're good for the climate. They help pull that carbon back out of the atmosphere. So we have in Scotland a lot of barren hills, a lot of grouse moors, for example, that are ecologically barren. And actually, they don't bring in much economic value as well. So if we can look at the land in Scotland as something that we all collectively own, it should be worked to the benefit of all of us, not just a few rich tax dodgers. Sorry, that's political. Right, so I want to paint a picture for you of what a green Scotland would look like. In a future green Scotland, our cities are well connected by inexpensive trains. We work a 4-day working week, which means we have more time to spend with our family and friends. We don't work 60-hour weeks to buy crap we don't need that's disposable. We make things to last, and we plan for future generations. Cities are safe for kids to ride their bikes in. You can walk easily and safely in the streets because they're not prioritizing cars. Because we get rid of miles and miles of cars, dead cars lying in the street, and replace that with greenery, with walkways, with bikeways. Cities are safe and fun places for everybody to hang out. Everyone always asks us, how are we going to pay for that? Well, the first point is, how are you going to pay to relocate those thousands and thousands of homes and businesses that will be flooded in 30 years? So the money is going to have to come from somewhere. Why not invest that money? And investing is different than spending. You expect a return on the investment. So let's look at investing. But the first thing is, take away the subsidies for oil and gas and aviation. UK gives the oil and gas industry £10.5 billion a year. That's more money than any other EU country does. We can repurpose that money. The other thing we can do is develop Scotland's renewable energy industry. Scotland, little Scotland, has 25% of all the renewable energy in Europe. We can become an energy powerhouse. We can use that energy for our own. We could, if we had the subsea cables, export that to Europe. We can re-energize our manufacturing industry by building the wind turbines and tidal turbines and wave machines and so on necessary to do that.
I ask you to begin to find that.
Absolutely. So we have a huge potential in Scotland to have a brilliant future. Now, I feel that that is best achieved as an independent country. A lot of the things that we need to create that future are currently not devolved. They're reserved to Westminster. fiscal and economic powers. Subsea cables is one of my particular bugbears because of the industry I work in. We can't export our energy because we have no power to install our own subsea cables. And the government in Westminster is not on board with that agenda that I've just laid out for you, whereas I feel that in Scotland, the people of Scotland are more in tune with that. And finally, I think that we're best placed to do that within the EU. The EU can help us crack down on tax havens, which is a global issue, and make sure that corporations and billionaires are contributing all this investment money that we need to build our country and not just stealing it from us.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, there's a lot there, and if questions are occurring to you, just make a jot, a piece of paper, and we'll come back, hopefully, and pick up on one or two of these threads. Thank you, Lorna. I'm going to move now in reverse order to Jamie and invite you for 4 or 5 minutes to set out how you see things.
Thanks very much indeed. I think Lorna's absolutely right in regards to climate change, but there are other huge challenges that we face in terms of automation, ageing population, genuinely a more unstable world, and Scotland and the United Kingdom's place in it. Social media and misinformation, I think, is an important area that we're probably not necessarily focused on, but you know, we consider ourselves more informed than we've ever been. Are we more informed, or are we more ill-informed? Just because of the kind of the propensity for kind of fake news. I think part of the issues with many of the challenges we face, we're now facing them increasingly divided as society. And that can be on social or geographic reasons. It can be on political reasons, whether it's Brexit or independence. And there's it's absolutely vital that we start coming back together again. We start working together on, you know, some of the challenges that we face, because, you know, we see it in Parliament. There's a lot of rhetoric spoken, but there's actually quite a lot of working behind the scenes on campaigns and issues. The MESH campaign would be one example where there was cross-party support, but others in terms of drugs and a variety of areas. There is a common ambition that once that's, when parties work together, when individual politicians work together, it's far more effective than the kind of dissected kind of nature that we have at the moment. I think we also need to see more honesty from politicians, and that may not surprise many of the people here, but it's an honesty on what can be delivered and what we have the power to deliver in Scotland, what is responsibilities elsewhere. Since we've just celebrated 20 years of the Scottish Parliament last year, you know, 20-odd years ago, the only parliament, or the parliament with the most impact on Scotland's day-to-day issues was Westminster. It's now the Scottish Parliament. Issues around local councils, health, education, law and order are largely taken in Scotland. When that parliament first started, it was far more focused under the first executive on policy, on you know, some of the things, the ideas that we could make our own decisions in Scotland on issues around smoking bans and the like. I think it's become more constitutionally focused in the last few years, and I think we need to get back to that stage when we actually really start talking far more about policies, because, you know, there are big issues in Scotland that we need to address around health, around education, around law and order, how we deliver public services across the country. And I don't want to sit here and kind of lecture my party's position, because we'll obviously be putting through an offering at the next parliamentary elections next year, and it will be taken on the basis of listening to people like you here in this room. The one thing I would say as a priority is I'm not particularly interested in getting into arguments about EU flags flying outside the Scottish Parliament or whether Big Ben bongs on Brexit Day. I think there are far more important issues that we need to be talking about. Those are divisive issues. Let's start talking about the issues that we can all come together on, because if we start doing that, we've got the power to actually be able to go out and really make a difference in communities across Scotland, rather than just in certain communities on certain issues.
Thank you very much indeed. Angela, following on from Jamie, how do you see things, and what are the priorities and the challenges that you see face the people of Scotland?
I suppose the outcome of the general election, if I'm honest, has crystallised what I felt for a long time. And I have to say I'm very much triggered back to the 1980s. There's a back to the future feel about some of this, where the UK government, in terms of power and political representation, does not represent the way in which Scotland as a whole voted for. But I suppose the big difference between now and then is that we have a Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament is still very much in its infancy. It's just celebrated its 20th anniversary. And we have two spheres of government at a UK level and at Scotland that I suppose, just to state the facts, are very different. I have never believed in Scottish exceptionalism. I don't think we are any better. I don't think we're any nicer or necessarily fairer than our friends and our neighbours south of the border. But what has happened in Scotland is that people vote differently, and therefore the political priorities are different. And I do believe change is coming, and it's how we can all, either as politicians, but also as citizens, how we can influence that and not be passive about it. And we have to remember that progress isn't automatic with the passing of time. Progress for our society isn't always linear. And the author, Zadie Smith, talks about how to protect progress, for it to survive, you really have to look after it and constantly reimagine it. And I think, you know, we just can't take either notions of progress or indeed our democracy, given events over the past year or so. We can't take any of that for granted. In terms of a more point of principle and belief, I absolutely believe that people have the right to change their minds. They've got the right to stick to their guns. And people can absolutely advocate and do everything to advance their point of view and perspective, whilst also working with others in common cause. And I would like to see more of that in politics. I think that's something that the Citizens' Assembly will help with. But that holding dear to your own views and values, whilst also working with others to find common cause, is actually, it's what grown-ups are meant to do. It's what happens in the real world. It's what happens in family homes, and it's what happens in businesses, the length and breadth of the country. But what's been really missing, I think particularly since 2016, is that ability to stick to your guns. Nobody's asking anybody to sacrifice what they believe in, but also to negotiate and reach out to others. And if I can do a bit of compare and contrast, prior to 2014 you had two governments, UK government absolutely opposed to independence, you had a Scottish government absolutely in favour of independence, but they were able to come to an agreement, and that was the Edinburgh Agreement about how to allow the people to have their say. The UK government, at present anyway, is saying no, Scotland doesn't have the right to choose. If we also compare what happened after 2014 to what happened after 2016, in 2014, my side lost. You know, I lost. My movement lost. And nonetheless, there was the Smith Commission. You know, and it was a process that I felt was too quick. It wasn't inclusive enough of broader society. I think in terms of outcomes, I was critical. It didn't give us enough powers, or indeed a cohesive package of powers. But nonetheless, it moved us forward, and you know, you grasp what you can when you can to make an impact. You do as much as you can for as long as you can. Whereas it is, for me, at a very human level, I find it really hard to understand for those who really wish to protect the union, this voluntary union, by not finding some accommodation for Scotland, the highest Remain voting part of the UK. So, you know, there are unresolved issues. The constitutional issue is not going to evaporate. Brexit is, you know, we're right up against it. And I find it is interesting that both Philip Alston, the UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, and John Major both agree that the risk with Brexit is that it's those with least who will lose most. And for me, the where powers lies has always been indivisible from the bread and butter issues. But I do think we've been perhaps poor at explaining that relationship. And if I can just touch on some of those issues. Yes. So over the next 25 years, 100% of Scotland's population growth is projected to come from migration. And that's important if we don't want to see our working age population decrease. And our working age population very much ties into economic growth and actually how we're currently funded. I very much want to see the right to food enshrined in Scots law for all sorts of reasons that people will understand. But the reason that food poverty is on the increase, or one of the main reasons, is that it's driven by universal credit and the so-called problems with welfare reform. In terms of things like fuel poverty, we have an ambition to end fuel poverty by 2040. That feels a long way off, but the biggest driver of fuel poverty is energy prices, which we don't have the ability to control because of the reserved devolved settlement. And my very final point is that just now there are millions of pounds spent on mitigating decisions taken by the UK government, and that isn't sustainable. Because in the longer term, what we must be doing to address increasing levels of poverty and inequality is actually to spend our money and our resources on lifting people out of poverty, as opposed to holding them where they are and preventing their position from getting worse. So there are many choices we need to make. The Citizens' Assembly, I think, will be a big part of that. It could be a big part of actually changing culture in politics and in Scotland. And while what you're trying to do is very different, it isn't entirely alien either, because while the Scottish Parliament can be this really feisty, robust place that you will look at and you will say, my word, you know, there are children at school who behave better than these parliamentarians when they're all heckling and shouting at each other. But behind that, I believe there is a desire for people to work together. You see that at committees, and you know there are reasonable working relationships across the political divide.
That's a positive note. Well done. So Richard, if you would conclude this initial stage of conversation and set out how you see things, please, with the challenges and opportunities that arise.
Yeah. Well. I will in due course deal with challenges and opportunities, perhaps in the conversation that we're going to have. But what I wanted to do was really just to use the short time that I've got to talk a little bit about the different kind of Scotland that we could be, because it seems to me that one of the tasks which has fallen on your shoulders as members of this first Citizens' Assembly is, in a sense, to look to the future and not simply to dwell on the immediate processy kind of questions that we as politicians are often dogged by. So I wanted just to say a few things about how I think Scotland could be different. I think we could be, in the future, a much more equal and a much more tolerant society. I think that we could have the ambition to have a society which is free from fear, free from the fear of hunger, free from the fear of public squalor, which is all too often the feature in too many of our communities, free from the fear of homelessness, which is something which is increasingly preoccupying too many people in too many communities. I want to see a Scotland where life expectancy is going up and not coming down. I want to see a Scotland where there is dignity for people in older age, dignity for people in retirement. And here we are sitting in a facility that was once paid for with public money to construct a private hospital, which was taken into the National Health Service by a former Scottish government. Those are the kind of changes that we can make. And I want to see a Scottish Health Service which is properly invested in, but an understanding that it's not just about hospitals, it's about how we can improve public health in Scotland and how we can invest in preventative actions. It's also, in my view, about looking in the way that 1945 generation looked at the need for the investment in a national health service, free at the point of need, paid for out of general taxation. How can we build something equivalent in the 21st century around the needs of an ageing population? Why can't we have a Scottish care service which provides that comprehensive support for people when they need it? So we need, I think, some big ideas and some big thinking in the debate. I also think that there needs to be investment in comprehensive childcare free at the point of need as well. And I think the point was made earlier about, well, how are you going to pay for this? We need to have a serious look at the taxation system. And we need to look at how we rebalance the burden of taxation, because the truth of the matter is the taxation that you pay if you are in work on your earnings is considerably more than the tax you would pay on so-called unearned income through things like share dividends and wealth. And so we need to have, I think, a serious debate as a society about where that balance of taxation needs to fall in the future. I want to see a Scotland where we have education built around the principle of lifelong learning. And lifelong learning so that we have education for its own sake, not just simply education for the needs of the economy. But there are those challenges that lie ahead of us as a society, the challenges of climate change, the challenges of the automation revolution, which will require that investment in lifelong learning as well. I want to see a Scotland where culture is part of people's everyday life, and that we value that as a priority and not simply as an add-on. And I want to see a Scotland where we are not just talking about parliaments and the distribution of powers between parliaments, but that we are talking about strong local government and a move away from the model we have at the moment, which is local administration, where central government too often sets the priorities and the targets and the restrictions on locally elected representatives. So I want to see a new era, a new phase of municipal investment and greater democracy at that level. And all of that, in my view, needs to be built on a very different kind of economy, an economy where it's simply not the case that the planet and people serve it, but the economy serves the people and the planet, and that we have, again, a refocus of our priorities. And I want to see an economy where there is much greater democracy, where people have a much greater say, so that there are more rights for working people, where we do move away from the long hours culture, which dominates many people's lives, and an understanding too that we need to see not an increase in the retirement age, but we should look at ways of bringing the retirement age down, using that revolution, that fourth industrial revolution of automation. So I want to see more diverse ownership in the economy. This is Scotland, the home of Robert Owen, the place where the Fenwick Weavers developed the first cooperative. I want to see a much more cooperative economy, where people have got a right to start to own the businesses that they work in. And we saw the flickerings of the possibilities of that in the early years of the Scottish Parliament with the Land Reform Act, where we said that communities should have a statutory right to own the land where they live. We should be extending that, giving more communities more opportunities to do that, but we should also be looking at how people in the world of work could also have statutory rights to start to own the businesses in which they are, in no small measure, the creators of the wealth. So I want to see a changed Scotland. I want to see a changed Scotland inside the United Kingdom, but I want to see more powers for the Scottish Parliament. I think, as we discussed in the earlier session, as you discussed in the earlier session, Brexit throws into the realm that we need to consider what's going to happen to those powers, where are they going to sit, and how can we best use them. And I would like to see that principle of subsidiarity. Where can those powers most effectively be used, and how can they be used at as much as possible a decentralised level? So I think that we need to have vision in politics. I think that you need to kind of think outside the box, think of the future, because I tell you that if past generations didn't think in that way, we wouldn't have a national health service, we wouldn't have a welfare state, we wouldn't have had full employment, we wouldn't have had the rights that people now have got as citizens. So we need to think long term, think about the big ideas, and understand that in the end, we do make our own history.
I'm going to open this up very shortly to you for questions, but I just want again to ask you to reflect on the extraordinary event of the last 25 minutes or so, and how much you have heard, how much you have been given the opportunity to consider, and the way in which each of these 4 politicians have delivered to you the message that they want to get across to you. How interesting it has been, and perhaps eye-opening in some respects also. But I have a question for each of you. Given that you've listened to each other, and I hope that you have, let me ask this one question. What could you each work together on as political parties and as politicians in Scotland in the long-term interest of the people of Scotland? Lauren, I'll start with you.
So I was very pleased to hear my colleagues talk about inequality, and the way to deal with inequality is to reform the tax system, as some of my colleagues noted, particularly taxing wealth and property more fairly. Taxing work is crap. You work really hard. You should keep more of that money. Let's tax the unearned wealth. And the other thing we can work together on is devolving power to local communities. There was some conversation about that. So making sure that people have more of a say. So I think those are areas that we could work very productively together.
Okay. Angela?
So I think issues of public sector reform and really looking at where power should lie. So in terms of how local services are delivered, I think there's a great appetite not just for local government to be more in control or to lead more in their local areas. I think there's that desire at a community level. And there is a local governance review which is not looking at local government on its own, but it's looking at how public services interact across the public service in terms of, like public health, is very much an NHS, but how it's delivered locally and with other partners. And I think there are issues that we could work on about having quite bespoke people-centred services, learning a lot from the new Social Security Agency as well.
Okay,
But
if you don't mind,
Not at all.
apologies for reason. Thank you for that. Jamie, what about you? On what could you and other parties work together?
Yeah, I think one of the areas that was raised initially by Lorna and others, around sustainability and climate change. I come from the Highlands Islands. There are huge opportunities and huge amounts of good work being done up there in terms of development. EMEC, the European Marine Energy Test Centre, is a global centre for testing some of the renewable technologies of the future. And that's a great opportunity for Scotland, for the United Kingdom, for Scotland, to play a vital role, or to continue to play a vital role in testing. But also what we need to then be looking at is the opportunity to build as well. We talked about manufacturing. A lot of these technologies, if we get it right, can be built here, and that's good, high-quality jobs in actually communities that really, really need them. And I think we would all agree that that's a very positive situation. Okay. Sorry if I'm cutting in and out a little bit, but
yes,
I'll just keep talking. So.
Yeah. Richard, how do you work together?
Well,
on what do you work together? I'll come to the how shortly.
Well, it's got to be climate change, hasn't it? There is no greater challenge. There is no greater challenge, and we really are all in this case. We really are all in this together, and we've got a responsibility, not just to ourselves, but to the as part of a richer nation in the global north. We've also got responsibility to the poorer nations in the global south as well. So it's about us having an internationalist outlook, and it's about us understanding that we are citizens, not just of Scotland, but we are citizens of the world, and we've got a common humanity. and a responsibility to each other as well as to the planet. So on those universal values, I think that we can forge a common agenda.
Right. What I'd like to ask you now, before opening this up to questions, is about how many people in this room are concerned about the way in which politics are conducted. They're concerned about what they perceive to be the abuse of the personal abuse which is cast by politicians against each other. They're concerned about, I think you use the expression, Jamie, fake news, whatever that may be. They're concerned about an apparent absence of honesty, but just the whole way in which things are done. So I want to ask you all, how can you ensure that you can work together really effectively and perhaps modify the way in which politics are done so that you can achieve real progress together? Jimmy, may I start with you this time?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that does happen. I mean, there are 4 members of the Scottish Parliament in this room. All of us have sat on committees together, have sat on Standards Committee with Patrick, and we've all agreed and worked together on certain areas. It does happen. Unfortunately, the rhetoric sometimes outside of particularly committees in the chamber and outside of that is very different to actually what goes on, you know, on a kind of day-to-day basis. But I really do think there has been, unfortunately, a ramping up. There is, you know, with large constitutional issues, whether it's Brexit or independence, there's always a passion out with that. I don't know exactly how to say we need to pull it back, because actually it's not something that I have ever, you know, really felt was the appropriate way to engage with political colleagues. We disagree. I criticise them if they disagree, but not in a manner that I've ever felt was kind of unpleasant or wrong. But it does have to happen, because I think the public will get increasingly fed up as, you know, the day-to-day issues that they face around hospitals and education, etc., you know, they see those happening and politicians just squabbling amongst themselves. So how is it achieved? I don't know. Maybe it's for you to tell us to some extent, but it does have to happen, because otherwise we're just going to be focusing on that, not on real key issues.
Thank you for that. Richard, short and sharp, how?
Well, look, as the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, I am in part culpable, because a lot of the coverage that the Scottish Parliament gets is around First Minister's questions, which is a very combative arena. Actually, outside of that, we've got cross-party groups on a range of things. So I'm on cross-party groups, and as the title implies, these are made up of representatives of some or all of the parties on a range of things. Like WASPI Women, for example, there is a cross-party group on WASPI Women where we work very closely with Sandra White from the SNP and others. So, I mean, there are these areas of joint working that exist, but I suspect a lot of those are below the radar, and what is projected through the media, and I'm not blaming the media, but what's projected through the media are those flashpoints that occur at 12 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, and perhaps we need to be better at engaging with people like yourselves in showing that there is another side to our politics. Look, I mean, I'm not going to get away from the fact that we do have differences in our ideas, not just our ideas about how we get to where we want to get to, but we do have differences in our ideas of where it is exactly we want to get to together, and that those differences will always exist. But I suppose it really is about the way in which those differences are expressed. And look, I doubt that we will come to some kind of great gooey consensus, but we need to have respectful discussions. And so when I said at the beginning of my 5 minutes about the need for a more equal, tolerant Scotland, that's about the way we conduct our politics as well.
And I'm sure it's not gooey consensus, but it's really robust approaches to where there are disagreement that we're looking to explore. Lorna, how would you deal with that?
So I'm not a parliamentarian. I'm looking at the Parliament, as you guys do, through the view of the news. And to me, that's a major difference between the Westminster Parliament and the Holyrood Parliament. So in Westminster Parliament, because it's a first-past-the-post voting system, you tend to have two parties that take turns getting in the power and shouting at each other across the aisle. There's very little incentive toward consensus building or negotiation. You try and get power with all your might, and then you grind the other guy into the ground. That's how it looks to me from the outside. Holyrood is different because Holyrood is a proportional system. So it's very hard to get a majority, which means there's a lot more consensus building and negotiation. It means that the person that you're arguing against next week might be the person whose vote you need this week. So you need to be much more civil. And I think that proportional representation means that. I mean, in Holyrood, if you look at the voting record, the Greens vote more with Labour than we do with the SNP. SNP vote more with the Tories than they do with anybody else. It's much more, you know, issue-based. So the Holyrood Parliament is relatively functional in this way, and that's because of the voting system. So what I would suggest to improve politics universally in the UK is to implement proportional representation UK-wide.
Thank you for that. Angela, wrap up this question.
I actually think the bigger question is about how politicians engage with members of the public, how they engage with communities of interest and communities of place and hard to reach groups. There is indeed an issue about how the two governments work together in terms of a UK and a Scottish level. And the reason I say actually our focus should be on communities and how we engage with the real world as opposed to how we engage actually with each other is about the long-term structural issues that in many ways can threaten our way of life when individuals and communities become alienated from society, whether it's through the rise of extremism or the rise of poverty and inequality. And I would much rather have the position where we shouted the odds at each other in chamber, and I appreciate that that is unedifying, and sometimes it is in bad taste, but where we can leave chamber and still have productive working relationships. I recently spoke to the president of the parliament in Catalonia, who says that in their parliament everybody sits very quietly, they don't interrupt, they don't heckle, they listen very respectfully to each other, but relationships are very, very poor across that parliament, and that is to do with the fact that some parliamentarians in Catalonia have friends, political colleagues that are imprisoned, and other parliamentarians are less sensitive to that. So I would much rather have our situation in Scotland.
That's a very interesting perspective. Thank you all actually for your perspectives on that. There's a lot of food for thought. Folks, will you take just a minute to turn to the person next to you and just have a chat about what you've heard, and if you'd like to begin to formulate a question, and we'll take as many as we can. And what I'd ask you to do is to be brave. No question is a bad question, I think, is one of your conversational guidelines. I know there are some of you with questions that we're a bit concerned about it. Take a moment to discuss what your question might be, or the questions might be. What the buzz in the room tells us is there's so much in this and so much opportunity, and maybe we're going to have to bring these folks back again on another occasion, but we'll make the best of the next 10 to 15 minutes, okay? So I'm going to sit back down again. I simply invite you to ask your questions courteously, succinctly, and to identify who in particular, if you like, you wish to answer the questions. Let me look for, I've got one here. I've got a microphone coming across. I'm going to try, if I may, to
we have questions from women, please.
I was just going to say that. Mix up the sexes if I can. Yes, sir.
I think is it Lorna her name is?
Lorna.
Yeah, you spoke about climate change.
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later.
I think you're right.
And I think it was Thursday night that Microsoft came out and says they will change in the next 10 years. And I think that's the first major company in the world that actually says 10 years instead of 2050 or 2060. So I think the bigger companies should follow the example.
So what's the question?
It's just, I think everybody, the question is, we need to change sooner rather than later, and how are we going to do it?
Other big companies to change quickly.
Yeah, how are we going to go about that?
So the answer is that governments need to use the powers that they have. That's the answer. So big corporations are not above the law. They have to follow the law. That's why they spend billions and billions paying politicians and lobbying. Governments have the powers to rein in those massive corporations. They need to use it. It's an advantage of being part of something like the EU. When you're part of a multinational organization, you can take on multinational companies. So that's a power that we're losing. But yeah, my answer to that is governments have to step in and make those laws, force those corporations to do it, because they mostly won't do it voluntarily.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer. Lady here.
Hi, yeah, so my question is, nobody has mentioned about housing. So obviously you're going on about people in poverty. So how are we going to overcome the people who are in poverty and don't have a house and get people off the street?
Okay, so I'll take that as directed to all of the panellists. So very, very short responses, please, if you can, on each of these matters. Just start at the far end and I'll just come along. Angela.
So we need to build more houses. I mean, that's the crux of it. There is lots of debates to be had about how we control high rents. But the bottom line is we need to build more houses. There are more houses being built in Scotland. But sometimes we have to have honest discussions with communities, because sometimes I'll get letters from constituents who don't want house building in their area, and the bottom line is we just need more houses, and that is something where we have control of in Scotland, whereas we don't have some of the big levers to control some of the big multinational corporate companies that we've mentioned earlier.
I think it's a really good question. I was actually listening on the way over here to Aileen Campbell, the Scottish Government Minister for Children, talking about the issues around poverty, and obviously housing is a major part of this. These issues are so much wider and more complex than we sometimes make them on. It is a question about building more houses. It's a question of building houses which are more energy efficient so that the bills aren't higher. It's a question of taking housing that is currently not being used and bringing it back into use. It's a question of making sure that, I mean, for example, I have a flat in Edinburgh. I've had a flatmate for 7 years. Now that's somebody that doesn't need or hasn't needed their own property. So it's about new properties, better use of existing properties, and improving other existing properties to bring them into line, and other wider issues as well.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, one of the phenomena of the last 20 years of devolution has been the trebling in size of the private rented sector. And so for some of us that might seem like we're going back rather than going forward. I would like to see more investment in public housing through housing associations, but also we should see council house building again for the needs that communities have got.
Laura?
Yeah, so I'm going to echo that I don't think it's just, the answer is just building housing. We're building tons of housing in Edinburgh, but it's speculative student housing, which doesn't help anybody. We're losing houses to Airbnbs. 7,000 Airbnbs in Edinburgh. That's 7,000 houses that Scottish people aren't living in. So we need to build the right kind of housing, and a lot of that has got to be social housing, which means government investment. That's what it means. We can't keep pretending that the private market is going to fix the housing situation, because it has utterly failed to do so.
Thank you for that. Tell you what, let's keep the applause to the end, shall we? Lose vital seconds.
No
Lady
clap.
over here.
I like it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't like speaking on this.
All right.
I agree with everyone. There's lots of issues: housing, climate, poverty, benefit. I want to take it back, and this is to the full panel. What we heard this morning was really complex about the UK government, the Scottish government, devolved powers. So trying to go back from that, we have people that represent us, and like you said, that you all have, I like the quote that the gent said, that you're all trying to do the same thing, but you do it in a different way. So just as a member of the public, if I look at anything with politics, all I see is arguing, or it's like a sales pitch, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And I think people are frustrated and annoyed and don't believe and lost trust. So I want to go back to the people that we obviously vote and say, how do you gain our trust? And is it maybe not about time it's a real shuffle, things are changed, made modern, made more simplistic to take Scotland forwards?
How interesting. Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
How do you regain trust? Might it be done by making things more straightforward or simple? Very, very quickly. I'll start with Richard and then work around and come back to Laura. Richard.
Yeah, there's a famous essay by a guy called R.H. Tawney in which he says that the Labour Party will never be successful if it simply tries to offer the maximum number of carrots to the maximum number of donkeys. In other words, you need to have a kind of central belief system, and you need to have a narrative that people understand. And so this kind of retail approach to politics, I don't think serves anybody well. And it's interesting that you are often called, and we are told as elected representatives, or people seeking to be elected representatives, that you are consumers. Well, you're not simply consumers. You are citizens first and foremost. And you've got a wider civic responsibility and duty, which you all clearly take very seriously. And I think there needs to be more understanding in the political realm about the importance of having values, having a belief set, and making sure that people can trust in you, because what you are saying and what you are standing for is enduring. and is
Jamie?
treading.
Sorry, Richard.
No, it's fine.
Jamie?
I think it's a really good point that's made. I think government, all governments, local, UK, Scottish, European possibly for this, has to be more honest about what they can deliver and apologise and be honest when they can't. And I think that's exactly the same with politicians. You know, whether we're going into elections, whether we're going to our constituents and saying, look, I'm going to try and get this done for you. I mean, I'm dealing with an issue that came up last night. I can't say to them, I'll get it sorted. I can say I'll do my best. And if I can't, you know, I have to go back and say I've done all I can. And if I haven't done enough, then I have to be held to account for that.
And I think people trust you more for doing that.
I hope so.
This is what I can do. Instead
Thank
of
you.
continuously say this is what we can do, we're going to do this. It's like sales pitches. People
Yeah.
think of both of that now.
Thank you again for that. Lorna, why don't you pick it up and then I'll finish with Angela.
Okay, so I've got a sort of 4-point plan I've just written down here. The first point is to get more ordinary people involved in politics, and that means a more diverse parliament. Our parliaments are still largely older, richer, white men. But they are. If you get more women, more young people, more immigrants, more disabled people in parliaments, then we all see people who look like us, who share our life experience. We instinctively know that they'll understand us better than people who've come through a really different route in life, perhaps a much more privileged route. A big thing that the Greens are keen on is something that they do more in Europe, which is smaller councils. So you have a much better chance of knowing who your councillor is. So in Europe, they have sort of one councillor for every 7,000 citizens, whereas here I think it's one for every 20,000, or so, it's some ratio kind of like that. If you could look in the eye the guy who is spending your taxes, you might feel a bit more like you could trust him.
Take the next two very quickly.
Yep. And the final one is this Citizens' Assembly. Ordinary people getting involved in politics. This is how, because you guys are going to make the change happen. And finally, I think the Electoral Commission needs to have teeth to actually punish people who lie during election campaigns and who cheat on their finances.
Angela.
And the lady's question reminded me that sometimes people will feel about politics how I feel when I watch people on telly arguing about things like football. So that's a good, it's good to have our feet held to the fire and grounded in that way. I think to be brief, we need to have the courage of our convictions. Doesn't mean we can't work with others. We really need to start thinking about the long term, notwithstanding that there's an urgency around poverty in terms of housing or in terms of climate change. Politics should be full of folk who look and sound like the people we're trying to represent. And I think accessibility of politicians. I hope we've showed some willing here today. I think by and large politicians in Scotland are accessible, but we also need to be clear about who's accountable for what and when. And that's why we need to have a better discussion about where power lies and what powers we have in Scotland and what powers we don't, and just a more, maybe a less emotive discussion and debate about the importance of powers, where they are, what they are, in relation to day-to-day issues.
Folks, I'm going to take a little risk here, and I'm going to assume we can eat a little bit into your coffee break and extend this just a little bit longer. Would that be okay with you all? Good, thank you. Gentleman here.
Yeah, one of the things we talked about was poverty, but no really mentioned pension poverty. We have one of the lowest rates of pension in Europe, in the UK. Is there any plans for any party to look at pension poverty? I mean, in Aberdeen, it's meant to be one of the richest areas in the UK. We have 20 food banks, and the majority are visited them by older people because they can't afford to eat and heat. So is there any plans for any of the parties to look at possibly pension reform in Scotland?
Pension reform, pension poverty, and what that means. Angela, may I start with you?
So we have this habit amongst the political classes, and I'm going to plead guilty here, where we talk about child poverty, we talk about pensioner poverty, we talk about food poverty, we talk about funeral poverty. And actually, do you know what? At the end of the day, it's just all poverty, and it holds us back as a country and as citizens, and it has a corrosive effect on our communities and our well-being and the very fabric of our society and our democracy. The point you raise, nonetheless, is well made. Pensions are, of course, reserved We know that changes to pension credits in particular have a huge impact actually on thousands of pensioner couples. One of the areas, according to Joseph Rowntree Foundation, as well as addressing the fact that we have a low, comparatively low pension payments compared to elsewhere in Europe, is that we also need to do more to ensure that our senior citizens actually claim what they're entitled to, and the vast bulk of pensioner poverty could be addressed if people claimed what they're entitled to.
Richard?
Yeah, but I think without wishing to disagree with Angela on that final point, there should be more universalism in the system, because one of the facets that is evident is that the older pensioners, who are often the poorest pensioners, are the least likely to claim pension credit. And so when we've had this debate about what happens when the free TV licences to the over 75s is withdrawn, if you're on pension credit you'll still get it, a lot of pensioners who need it are not claiming pension credit. And so we need to see a revisit of our whole approach to the welfare state, in my view, and understand that we've got a duty as a society to give people dignity in old age. And that should be for all of us. One of the challenges that we will face in the future is, with many people's working experience being based on precarious contracts, 0 hours contracts, low pay, intermittent contracts of employment, that will amplify the inequalities which will exist in retirement as well. So we need to have a fairly fundamental, in my view, rethink with an ageing population how we are going to tackle this. And there are no quick fix solutions. It's going to require investment, and it's going to require the application of an insurance type principle, so that we make sure that as a society we look after people when they need it, and old age is often when they need it, and older people who have built the society, the generation that have brought many of the benefits that we now are able to enjoy, deserve to be treated properly in their older age.
Jimmy?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree around entitlement and making sure that people have the information so that they are getting the support that they need. And one of the issues that I found in Orkney, in fact, when I was up in Shetland, was that those responsible for helping people with fuel poverty are saying that predominantly older people weren't identifying themselves as in fuel poverty for a number of reasons, but one because they didn't like being labelled as in fuel poverty, and so they weren't accessing the support that they needed there, and that was really important. So we've got to work with those areas where we do have support, where there is the money available, there is support available, but people aren't accessing it. Also, just very, very quickly, it's wider than that in terms of inequality. I've been dealing with a community that has lost their local bus service because the authority doesn't have the support, the money to be able to run it any longer. That's left a number of particularly older people in isolation. There's a dialer bus service they can use, but it doesn't fit in, which means they're not going into their communities, they're not meeting up with their friends, and they're not having that engagement with people that they've had in the past. And they're therefore losing out on some of those people that actually might have made sure that they were okay, giving them advice, being able to access some of the services. So again, it's a wider issue than just the pension issue, but I agree with you on the pension issue as well.
Nora?
Certainly we would like to bring up the UK pension to EU norms, but I also agree that there are other ways to make pensions go further. There's some interesting ideas going on about guaranteed universal services. So everybody in the country could be guaranteed bus routes to their houses, social care, food, these sorts of things, which would make pensions go further. But basic services should be free at point of use, like the NHS. Like, why isn't transportation free at point of use like the NHS is? It could be. We could structure society that way, and it would benefit everybody, but pensioners especially.
Now, I'm going to take two very quick questions, and I'm going to ask you to ask them quickly, and the responses to be very quick. Yes, sir.
Can I ask the panel, how do you feel about Scotland having a land tax, and have they got the powers to do that?
Scotland and land tax, and your question, please. This lady just right here, yep.
I was just wondering if you thought that the problems with the NHS was down to abuse of the system.
Okay, so land tax and NHS. So let's very, very quickly. Richard, may I start with you? And really, really short. Yeah, land tax or NHS or both, quickly.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think that there is a compelling case now because of the growth, not just in income inequality, but in wealth inequality, which is actually much greater. I mean, in Scotland today, the richest 1% own more personal wealth than the whole of the poorest 50% put together. In my view, that's shocking. And we need to do something about it. So we've spoken about the introduction of a wealth tax, which might be built around land, or it might be other means of measuring wealth. But if you levied a wealth tax at 1% on the millionaires in Scotland, you would bring in something like £2 to £3 billion straight away. So I think that's worth examining.
If you don't mind, I'll stop you on that one and move to Lorna. There's one of two questions to answer.
Land value tax is a core Green Party policy. Yes, no, Scotland does not have the power to do that. We would have to be an independent country. NHS, not because of abuse of the system. My opinion, it's chronic underfunding, but also a lack of social care, which means you can't get people out of hospital beds because they have nowhere safe to go in the community. Until we have our social care sorted, the NHS will continue to suffer.
Jamie.
Can I focus on the NHS question, because it's something that I've had experience of last year, and also in my region is so important. We're seeing communities losing local services. Yes, there is an issue with in terms of how we use the NHS. I think that's probably the way. People who go to their doctors or A&E with minor issues that they could actually see a pharmacist about. I think there's, as Lorna pointed out, there's the big issue around social care. There's a number of cases I'm dealing at the moment. That's causing bed blocking in hospitals, which makes problems even worse. I unfortunately had to have an operation last year where I wasn't sure if I could have the operation because they didn't know if they had enough beds, and there were wider issues. There is a huge issue, but I don't think it's just about funding. There is an issue about funding in the NHS. It's about how we use it. It's about making sure that it all works far better with our social care, our local authority, and things like that.
Thank you. Angela.
Lorna answered the question in relation to land tax. All I would like to add to that is a broader point that this generation of young people are at risk of being worse off than their parents. And that isn't acceptable and has to be addressed for all our collective future. So that requires us to look across our taxation system and how I suppose wealth is moved. But she's right to point out where powers lie. In terms of the NHS,
You keep this really sharp.
in terms of the NHS, I think the far bigger issue is around the impact of EU migration on staff who work in the NHS. I think that's a far more immediate issue, and the demographic issues around our ageing population, which is a positive, but also in terms of increasing demand on the NHS, particularly in terms of mental health services, for example. So I think there are bigger, more fundamental questions that we should be focused on, in my opinion.
Thank you, Andrew. You've each got 30 seconds to tell the members of the Citizens' Assembly what message you'd like to give them about how the Citizens' Assembly can help you all to achieve the things that you've been talking about today. Jimmy, may I start with you?
You can do, yeah. The one thing I would say is, which I've been slightly disappointed, we've not had an opportunity to hear from more of you, because I think there's a lot more questions that you could have put to us. So if we do come back, I would like you to be able to have the opportunity to speak more. I would just say be very, very honest about your priorities, as I think you've been when you're putting together your report, because it's the only way that we as politicians will get to hear what you really are after. And everybody will have different priorities, but I think there are some very common themes probably that we've heard today, and themes that we can take forward, because if we want to be an aspirational Scotland, we need to be addressing the issues that matter to the people who actually live here.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, Alistair Gray, the great author, just died very recently, and in his book, Lanark, there's a passage in it where he talks about the fact it's not the loud men on platforms who change things. And I think that's true. I think that all our history tells us that change comes from below, comes from active citizenship. And the work that you're doing this weekend, other weekends over the course of the next few months, can really make a difference and can contribute towards changing the political agenda, changing the tone of the political debate. And I would just, again, want to thank you for everything that you are doing, the sacrifices that you make, because you are, in your own way, making history.
Lorna.
I'm really impressed with the work that you guys have done so far. I can see that a lot of work has gone into this. I talked briefly earlier about how representational democracy is. You are different. You are representational. So you have the ability to do something that parliaments don't. Parliaments are often very short-sighted. They're looking only to get elected for the next term. Parliamentarians are worried about their careers. You don't have any of those worries. You can be open-minded and think about the future. You can think about people other than yourselves. And this is your power. You have something that parliaments don't. So use that power and think ahead about what kind of world you want for your kids and grandkids.
Angela.
2020 is a crucial year. For better or worse, there will be change. I hope you will articulate and take forward the change that you wish to see, given that you are representative. We can do better. We must do better. You have the opportunity to help politicians, not just have the courage of their convictions, but actually to think and plan for the long term and to think out with the box. And of course, remembering that some of this is evolving. As Disraeli said, finality is not the language of politics. So there's something about life continuing, and you have a great opportunity to help steer change in Scotland.
So 3 or 4 things from me. Firstly, I am really sorry we couldn't have more questions. I know there were others of you caught my eye. We will think about what we need to do about that for the future. I'm taking that to you now. Thank you, however, for your engagement, for listening, and for the excellent and focused questions which you asked. So thank you for your participation. Before you move back to the next room, we're going to ask you to pick up a coffee. If you need to go to the loo, that's fine, but to make your way straight back to the next room after this. But before we do this, can we just acknowledge and recognise the excellence of the participation of our 4 political guests this morning?
I don't know about that.
Okay, everyone, we are going to get some feedback from tables, which we're going to do relatively swiftly so we can get to our lunch.
Hello, I'll feed back on behalf of Table 9. And the 3 suggestions we had for moving forward, first around climate change, is that we accepted that actually in terms of making progress we needed global agreements, but at Scotland level, the very least we needed was cross-party commitments around climate change. Another suggestion was that we needed to make some legislation to focus minds and action around this, but there was also a need for supporting a process of change and not just to use legislation as a blunt instrument. The table also unanimously felt that the public need more factual and accessible information on the other issues that were discussed, not just climate change. They felt they get a lot of factual information, but we need much more of that kind of information on issues such as health, public service reform, education, and poverty.
Thank you. Tim.
Hi, this is on how we might move forward together, even when there are substantive differences between us. The table had decided that we would like the parties to work together to create a new revised Scottish constitution, because at the moment our constitution is very fractal when it's in pieces, and would like something that is written in baseline that politicians can be held accountable for, so they can collaborate to write something down to have fairer housing, health, and issues about climate change, all in one constitution.
Table 8, we agreed on one thing should be demonstrated by commitment by them all. What we mean by that is that they take an issue that's very pertinent to everybody in Scotland and make that the main issue and follow that through to the end before we spread out to another issue. It's the only way you can actually gain some kind of commitment from each different body and party, we feel. We'd like to see an improved connection between the elected politicians and the public, and more transparency. And what we mean by that is the politicians are fine that they live in their own bubble. They don't actually live in the world that we live in. They don't have the day-to-day issues that we have, sorry. So we'd like that to happen. And be more open-minded and less constrained by the party line. try and be a wee bit more independent. And I know that would be difficult because parties do stick together. Thank you.
Okay, table 3, we had quite a long list of about 5, so we've cut it down to 3. Okay, we had about 5, we've cut it down to 3 in terms of the 3 things that we think would help move things forward, even though we had quite a lot of consensus ourselves. The first one was we wanted to have the same access to facts about a situation and not allowing spin or agenda to dominate so that everybody can make their decisions independently. The second one was more cross-party consensus and mixed groups. We acknowledge that that happens at the moment, but we want there to be more, as well as possibly having mediation for important decision-making to reach consensus. And the third one was focus on a system that brings people together rather than being divisive, but still retaining healthy, progressive debate.
Yeah, table 10, we had quite a list. We managed to narrow it down. One of the things that we kind of come to consensus was we don't hear about the cross-party working as much. There needs to be more public engagement in that to say that this is happening. Behind the scenes, all we see is the Big Brother kind of style fighting debates. We looked at politicians need to be more grounded and in touch with the people. And that led on to better communication between us all, between politicians and members of the public, and almost creating like a public platform where members of the public have a voice. So very much similar to this. There needs to be more of this.
So table 2, so I'll keep this short and sweet. We need to reform the universal credit, more local committees, evaluate what the community needs, and have this enshrined in law. That's it. Thank you.
Table 12, couldn't get a volunteer, so I'll do it. More diverse, cross-party cooperation that's more visible, like other people have said. Decision-making being closer to communities, but a recognition that that needs a bit of investment in communities because they're very different and need help sometimes to engage with decision-making. And included more localised local government, encouraging responsibility and solidarity within communities for folk to support each other. Basic services like transport need to be provided because they currently aren't in many places, and that needs to put people before profit was the consensus in the group, which led on to thinking around a fair taxation system and distribution of wealth. And finally, more public ownership of services was the consensus in this group as one of the ways to deliver that.
Hello. So at table 1, our first point was tax reform for a fairer tax system, which is obviously kind of looking at the redistribution of wealth, better funding of public services to kind of take the burden. The second point was honesty and integrity in politics, which meant, proper consequences for politicians and media who were caught lying throughout. Well, I suppose throughout any point in their political career, because a lie is a lie. And then we kind of spoke about the idea of having fixed terms for representatives, not just the high hegians, anybody. And our third point was housing, the increased public role in housing through policy and provision, so that there's much more social, affordable housing there for the people, as well as with private rent, curbing the rent prices, potentially even curbing the amount of properties that landlords can own, because, well, anyway.
This is table 14. We also, some of our tables agreed on continue to work together across parties, and it came to light that we didn't realise that a lot of the decisions made were through cross-party agreements that we just assumed it was fighting against each other. So it was interesting to pick up that point for the discussions. We also thought that it would be more transparent about how decisions are made, letting us know the background to get to the decisions. Again, that would link in with the same sort of theme. And if it came to compromise with finding points that they agreed on, or if it didn't agree, was to stay together and all parties work together to find a point and then build on that source, rather than once a point's brought across, the rest of the parties pick the faults in it. You know, if they were all involved initially, then nobody could destroy the points for any other party. So I think that's where we kind of stood. Okay.
So we're table 4. Oh, wow. Table 4, and our 3 topics we were kind of discussing were having an informed discussion, so basing your information you're getting being not biased and not being pushed by any kind of stance or political, but just actually being transparent where it's come from. The second one was use of technologies to have a say, to kind of empower the people. We all have like phones, and why can't we just have an app on our screen to kind of, instead of voting for parties, maybe voting for policies that we believe in. And finally, kind of a focus on climate change to deal with the issues. Cool. Cheers.
Hi, this is table 13. We talked about, in terms of moving forward, the need for young people to develop life skills and support to develop life skills, and in terms of citizenship, increase their political knowledge and how they can influence change at a local level. We also talked about active citizenship for everyone, and that means greater accountability for local authorities, where we celebrate their successes, but also are able to kind of share things that we might question, but be able to share best practice as well, and more awareness about our local what our local councils are actually doing. The last one was around about climate change. We need to talk about the future of food production and energy in Scotland, and we need to have the powers in Scotland to set energy policy. And then there was a bit of a debate at our table if we actually have all the information about energy policy, and we felt that the Citizens' Assembly needs a bit more input into that, what powers we actually have, and what we need to go forward.
I'll give the feedback from table 5 and you can jump in if I get anything wrong. I guess we started by looking at the areas of agreement that we saw in the panel, but also from the table ourselves. And there were 3 sort of big ones really, I suppose, but we could have gone on, and there were lots of issues people wanted to kind of reach some agreement on. So there were action on climate change, the need for a specific housing policy that wasn't just about building more houses, but that picked up some of the things that were mentioned earlier this morning around them being environmentally friendly, but it being social housing, reusing housing we've already got. So looking at it really in the round. Also about the NHS and it there being a real, instead of it being a political football, being more cross-party working. And I think our group felt quite strongly that one of the things we don't hear about a lot is where there are areas where politicians do work together and there is cross-party agreement. But I suppose in terms of the approaches and moving things forward, one of the things we talked about on the table was the fact that the way our politics works, from our point of view, kind of leads to a lot of disagreement, and that might lead us to think about maybe changing the political system and how things are done, and things like, we didn't really specifically talk about proportional representation, but less of an adversarial system, really, people were interested in. And also, I guess, similar to what a lot of the other tables have talked about, was just doing more of this and getting real people involved in the decision making, a sense that politicians aren't representative as they should be and don't really understand the real people's lives, and that this kind of arena is really important, and to deal with that in the different issues around the NHS, climate change, being very specific about that.
Hi, table 11. Our ones are climate change to make an improved world for our future generations, public services funding to improve services, and NHS and social care to reduce bed blocking and better access to care.
table 6, actually, very succinctly, we looked at... Right, sorry, can you hear me now? Thank you. Very succinctly, we looked at various, very much things that are, on a local basis. We felt there wasn't really enough local involvement in politics, which could bring us all together. We looked at greater local community involvement on local issues, which is, I think, sadly lacking at the moment. Greater accountability for politicians' manifesto policies and broken promises, and greater accessibility to information on issues that impact on citizens' lives. In other words, let's hear about them before we read about them.
Brilliant. I think that's every table. Is that right? Yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Thank you. No, we're good, we're good. Thank you so much for your feedback, and thank you so much for doing that so clearly and succinctly. I think that works really well, so thank you so much. Yeah, you definitely deserve a round of applause. Yeah, of course, feedback isn't always an easy thing to do, and it's something that you need to learn sometimes how to do it, and you've done it all expertly, so thank you, and I'm sure there'll be so many opportunities to do that throughout the Assembly as we go on. So I just want to hand over to Kate now, and Kate is going to tell you a little bit about a member point session that we have coming up after the break, and then we'll be heading into lunch after that. So Kate, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. And again, I think this morning really ably demonstrates the commitment to this process and the maturity of the discussions that we're having. And I just commend you for the mature approach that you're taking to each other and to this process. I'm not going to spend very much time now. I just want to explain that I mentioned yesterday evening that they were going to have a kind of open space time for any members in the Assembly who feel that there's something that we've kind of need to feed back to the Assembly as a whole. And I would like you to, if you have an issue that you feel that the Assembly need to have more time to consider or think about, I would encourage you to make your way to the Secretariat desk just before you have your lunch, just to register that. What we'll do then is bring back any statements that Assembly members feel need to be discussed slightly further by the Assembly after lunch, and we'll have a short period up to about 30 minutes to review and reflect and vote on those issues, okay? I don't think I have anything else to say. I know you have very kindly caught us up with lunchtime. So if you have an issue that you really think needs to go back to the Assembly, please make your way to the Secretariat table now. We'll list it and then we'll get a chance to reflect on it after lunch. Okay, but thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah. It must have been an incredible lunch. You all took a little bit longer to come back than we anticipated, but I hope it was delicious. Righto. So, we've got a little light admin task just for the first 10 minutes that we're back together, which is around revisiting consent. So you may remember in the first weekend that you were asked to give your consent for filmcast and for photography. So we just need to revisit that, and your table facilitators will just take you through that task. And then you might be wondering why we have electronic voting up on the screen. The reason we have that, yeah, very exciting. The reason we have that is because after we've revisited consent in about 10 minutes, we're going to hear from members that have come to the desk and said they would like to raise a point in this session. And then we're going to have a discussion at our tables about process, and we may be or may not be voting on some resolutions that have been suggested by those members that have raised the point. So we'll be back in about 10, so table facilitators, take it away for the consent. Thanks.
So thank you very much for coming back into the room. As I mentioned briefly yesterday evening, we've recognised that there does need to be a period of time when the Assembly reflects on issues from previous weekends and reflects on issues that 1 or 2 or 4 Assembly members feel that they want to present back to the Assembly. So we're going to take a little bit of that time now, and what we're also going to do is we are going to wrestle with some live technology. I have my glamorous assistant here. Thank you. Now, we're going to do a test of this first, And then we'll go into the statements that need to go back to the Assembly or have been requested. So you will find on your table one of these little pads. Everybody has one. Okay, does everybody have a pad in their hand? I should be taking a vote on whether you've got a pad in your hand, but that's too much. So Chris, who is in charge of the technology, is going to try this out. Electronic voting. And the reason we're introducing this now is because there may be opportunities and times in the future when we want to rely on electronic voting, so we thought we'd get used to it this weekend. So the very difficult question for you to deliberate upon. Yes. Here we are. Okay, so the very difficult question we're asking you to deliberate on first to see if this works is it Saturday or Sunday today? Number 1 on the keypad for Saturday. Number 2 on the keypad, if you feel you need to use it. I'm not wanting to skew the vote. And can you just, don't be alarmed, the last button you press is the one that will go in. You can change your mind. I hope you don't have to change your mind on this one, but you can change your mind on this one on future votes. It's the last button that you press records your vote. Chris, is there anything I need to add?
No, just press your button firmly. It does happen to be slightly better if you don't hide it under the table, but apart from that, it should just work. Okay?
Okay, so has everybody cast their vote as to whether today is Saturday or Sunday? Oh. Handy numbers there. Anybody swithering? Yes. Okay. And there we have it. Yes. Now, Chris has stated this is exactly the kind of response we expected. I think there's 10% of us are aspirationally hoping that it's Sunday, but I have to let you know it is actually still Saturday. Okay, so that's how the system works. Does that kind of chime with everybody? And we think we can use this system again. Okay, thank you, and thank you, Chris. Yeah. So as we mentioned last night, we do want to build in some time for the Assembly to potentially chew over some nuanced information or bring things back to you as an Assembly. Remember, right at the beginning of this, we stated that this is your Assembly, it's not ours, it's yours. And this is the time to reflect on some statements that need to be, that the Assembly members would like to discuss in further detail. So the first one of these reflects one of the statements that came to the 67 statements that we looked at the second weekend. I think you'll have been aware that there was some thoughts around that. So Michael, one of our Assembly members, has suggested that the Assembly as a whole discusses if we should replace have housing for all Scottish people first with prioritise housing for those who need it most. There was a suggestion that the statement could be taken out of context, and so you've got to decide as an Assembly, could that first statement be taken out of context, and could we replace it with the slightly clarified line below? So that's prioritise housing for those who need it most. We're going to take one more statement that you're going to discuss, and I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member.
So this morning our political panel narrowed it down to climate change and housing. we propose that we have another political panel whereby it's opened up to a wider scope, hopefully discussing things like education, public service, health, police, fire, ambulance, and we propose that there's preset questions by the citizens' members that are presented to the political panel before it's opened up to open questioning.
Okay, so those are the two statements that we would like you to deliberate upon for the next 10 minutes. This replacement statement, and then the next proposal that the political panel come back and that the Assembly members form the questions prior to the panel coming back. Okay, so is that clear? Okay, so if you could take 10 minutes now to discuss that in your tables, and then we'll come back to a vote at the end. Thank you. Hello, just to say that we're getting both of those statements to be deliberated on, typing up on the screen. Chris is typing furiously here, and they will both appear on the screen for memory. Apologies, we should have got that first.
Yeah, and just to remind everyone that we are really happy to capture general points about process coming up in your discussion too. So feel free to capture them on our flip charts. And of course, they'll be taken into consideration in design and whatnot too. Thank you.
Okay, can you start kind of drawing to a conclusion on your votes? Okay. Is everybody close to yes? Okay. Okay, right. So we're going to thank you very much for working through this process. Chris and I will now handle this like the experts we are. Thank you. So we're going to take the first question, replace the statement to make it read prioritising housing for those who need it most. It is yes, no, or more information. So yes is 1, 2 for no, 3 for more information to be brought back at another juncture. We are going to register at least 100 votes, and it will be a majority vote as we move forward. Okay, so could I ask you to please cast your votes? Okay, if anybody hasn't had a chance to send their vote, if you could do that within the next 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay, so I think there is a clear vote to rephrase that statement to read prioritise housing for those who need it most. Okay, thank you. And we're moving on to the next statement. Should we have another political panel at the next meeting where the Assembly members set the questions? If you could please vote. Again, 1 for yes, 2 for no, and 3 for more information. Thank you. Okay, if anybody else wants to press the button in 3, 2, 1. I think that shows a very clear majority that 91% of those who have voted want to have another political panel where the Assembly set the questions. Okay, so thank you very much for engaging with that. Can I just have a show of hands? Did you find that process quite straightforward? Good, lovely. Okay, thank you very much. We're going to move into the next session. Is everybody settling down? And can I just check, can everybody hear me clearly when I'm speaking like this? No, not really. Okay, can we turn the volume up a little bit? Is that okay? Great. Okay. If I get too quiet, just stick your hand up, and I'll enunciate more clearly. So, as Kelly said back in the room, you prioritised 22 statements that represent common ground, and that one of them was the kind of Scotland we are seeking to build will be a sustainable country balancing environmental, economic and social impacts for the good of the country and its citizens. And as you know, all our work this afternoon and then tomorrow morning will be about sustainability, to pick up on that theme. And we're going to start thinking about, in the morning, how the statement connects with the constitutional options. And this is really starting us off on answering the question, our second question of the Assembly remit, which is how best can we overcome the challenges Scotland and the world face in the 21st century, including those arising from Brexit. Now, this afternoon, you're going to hear from 3 speakers with 3 different perspectives on how we can become a more sustainable country that balances out those environmental, economic and social impacts. And the speakers to my left will pitch their positions, outlining the choices and trade-offs associated with their perspectives. Now, there are some hard choices which will require to be considered. And we really hope that their pitches will give you some food for thought to help you consider priorities for action in this area going forwards. Each speaker has prepared a more detailed paper outlining their position in full, and you'll be able to find those on the website, and there'll be some copies on your table when we go back into the other room. So after that, there'll be a panel discussion, which I'll chair. After we've heard the 3 pitches, there'll be a panel discussion, which I'll chair, and an opportunity for you to ask questions to the speakers. Now, I'm going to be incredibly tight on time with that, because I understand that, you know, there's a lot of questions arising. If we don't get the opportunity to pose the questions to the speakers in this room, we will endeavour to find another method of getting the questions that arise to them. So following that, you'll have a chance to deliberate on the matters to identify what you think are the key challenges, and also the opportunities and priorities for action to make Scotland a sustainable country. And in the Sunday session, your priorities will be considered in relation to our current constitutional arrangements, and we'll be able to tap into the expertise of Chris and Alan to help us kind of think about that. So it feels to me very clearly that as an Assembly we're moving into new and exciting territory, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what we can develop together on this. But before I introduce you to the speakers, I'd like to return to your statement. So there's a huge amount in the statement that you put together and crafted so well. And it's a huge challenge that it lays down to the country as a whole, and I think we started to touch on that this morning. So it's wonderful to see that the social, environmental and economic issues are all important to you, but as you say, and as you stated, it's the balance between those 3 things that make it so difficult to kind of work to achieve the balance between those 3. And it's kind of like all areas of life, we have to make those hard choices to get where we want to go. But I was also struck by how your statement reflected the kind of the wider range of statements that you produced last weekend. And I suppose if you think about the television and about everything about the Glasgow Climate Change Conference coming up later in the year, it's perhaps not surprising because it's very much in the ether. And I think it's clear that a lot of people are realising that this is a challenge that faces Scotland. So to kind of illustrate that a bit more, we've got a few videos that I think encapsulate some of the challenges ahead.
Where that light is, it's supposed to show how much sea levels will rise according to what scientists are predicting right now.
That's high. Very high.
The work, called Lines, was installed by Finnish artists Timo Aho and Pekka Nyttivirta a year ago on the Scottish island of North Uist, population 1,200. They wrap around an art centre and a disused dairy and slice across the field that separates the village from the open ocean. How do the lights work? What turns them on?
The lights are turned on when the tide comes in. We have float switches in the bay, which when the tide comes in, the floats pop up.
How do people understand climate change around here?
I think people are definitely aware of climate change to really affect life here. It's very low-lying islands, which are even now prone to flooding.
Do you think that art installations like this one might change a person's mind or make them think about it more?
Do I think art can save the planet? I do, actually. That's what art does. I think it can create debate around lots of issues and make us ask questions. What is this about? What are we doing?
Over 1 million people were given emergency food in Britain last year. And the numbers are growing. The food bank goes to the front line of food poverty.
He got quality straight land, come on, I mean, I got Happy Man's best.
And meets those struggling to survive.
I had to scrape together pennies out of a piggy bank to pay for my son's snack at nursery.
There's my cupboard.
Driven to the brink.
I ended up shoplifting and ended up doing it until I actually got caught.
And close to the edge.
And then I was going to jump there.
Hello, Dundee Food Bank. Kirsty speaking. How can I help?
It's the kind of place that anyone can find himself. I mean, a couple of paychecks away.
We're at nothing.
When you got kids to feed and whatnot, it's just, you just don't know what to do next, you know what I mean? It couldn't be any worse, really.
If it wasn't for the food bank, God only knows.
So about 1,500 square miles of highland is covered in blanket bog, which when it dries out, I mean, it needs cool, wet conditions in order to thrive. But when it dries out as a result of warmer temperatures, it releases massive quantities of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Now, carbon dioxide's bad enough, but methane is much, much more potent as a greenhouse gas. So all this sequestered carbon and methane, if it gets released into the atmosphere, could have absolutely devastating impacts for not just Scotland, but for the world. I mean, at this moment in time, the peatland in Caithness holds about the equivalent of Scotland's total emissions for 3 years. And over and above the environmental aspects, you've got a lot of people whose livelihoods depend on the peatland in terms of water supply, in terms of agriculture, in terms of sheep farming, in terms of tourism. So it's not just the environmental impacts, it's the socio-economic impacts that it will have on otherwise quite vulnerable local people.
So I think you can see there some of the reasons for the very sharp focus and the importance of becoming a sustainable country. But what actually does it mean? So just to unpack it a little bit, in its broadest sense, in the meaning of the word, sustainability is the ability to exist constantly. A sustainable country is one which can meet the needs of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And sustainability refers to three distinct areas, as you so rightly discovered last weekend: environmental, economic and social. And these are known as the three pillars of sustainability. So the first pillar, environmental sustainability, is about protecting and maintaining environmental resources for future generations. So this includes the long-term health of our ecosystems, species diversity, renewable energy resources, and preventing the consequences of man-made global warming. And what does this mean to you, the Assembly members? So this slide shows a few of the statements written by individuals that you use to craft this priority statement. And so I think I tapped that off, sorry. These range from put the environment above all else to be ambitious and aggressive in combating climate change. So what about the second pillar, economic sustainability? This is about making sure that economic growth produces fair outcomes for everyone and we don't consume more resources than the earth has to offer. And so related to this economic sustainability idea is this notion of inclusive growth. So this is growth that combines increased prosperity with greater equality, creates opportunities for all, and distributes the benefits of increased prosperity fairly. So it's about promoting fair work, about good quality jobs, and about tackling inequality and changing the dynamics of Scotland's cities, regions and rural areas to make sure success and opportunity is shared across the whole of Scotland. And our speakers will be exploring this in more detail. And again, what does this mean to you? On this slide, we've got a few of the statements that, again, individual members last weekend used to craft your priority statement. And these range from eradicate in-work poverty to have a greater and stronger state pension. And you can see how these things are kind of echoing throughout our whole deliberations and work. And the third pillar is social sustainability. This is about people and about how we create socially sustainable communities, equal, diverse, connected, democratic, and with a good quality of life. If you remember, we discussed values and quality of life last weekend. And a challenge is achieving social sustainability. Really at the centre of that is about tackling inequalities. Now, from the 353 individual statements you put forward last time, I was really struck by the vast number of statements that kind of picked up on this theme. A quick search of equal, fair and poverty amongst the 353 statements finds around about 80 of them highlighting this one issue. And some of these have been drawn out on the slide, which include eradicate poverty in all forms and free equal educational opportunities for all. So I think it's clear that this is a theme that really runs through the Assembly. Now, although this is traditionally how sustainability is viewed, some commentators don't consider the economy as an equal pillar, but more of a subset of both society and environment. And I think, Catherine, you'll be touching on that later. So what is Scotland doing? How are we approaching sustainability at the moment? So in 2015, the countries of the United Nations signed up to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Now, this is a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. And as the UN Secretary General put it so succinctly, we don't have a plan B because we don't have a planet B. And I think that kind of sums it up pretty clearly. As part of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's a universal call to action. They've set out 17 ambitious goals that are underpinned by 169 specific targets that UN nations are expected to achieve by 2030. And so the goals are on this slide, and you'll also have a set of these goals on your table. And I think, again, I'm really struck with the commonality between your 22 prioritised statements from last weekend that we were together and the Sustainable Development Goals. So Scotland was one of the first countries to commit to the SDGs, as they are sometimes known, in 2015. And in signing up to this, Scotland, the Scottish Government, kind of made a really bold statement of intent, not just to the people of Scotland, but to the world as a whole. But the SDGs are required to be developed locally, so each country needs to get involved in how they are kind of played through in their own country. So in Scotland, we have adopted them through the National Performance Framework, NPFs, and the National Performance Framework has placed the SDGs, sorry, far too many three-word acronyms, but the National Performance Framework has placed the SDGs right at the heart. Now, you may recall that we looked at the National Performance Framework last weekend that we were together, and we looked at it in context of our consideration of well-being. So this may not be a completely new format to you. However, it was some time ago. We've gone into a new decade, and I just wanted to make clear that you're aware that the NPF is Scotland's well-being framework. So you may have also seen today and yesterday that we've got the NPFs in large form, beautifully illustrated in the entrance hall beside the Secretariat table. And I see that some people have been enthusiastically colouring them in already, and I would encourage more of that work. So these NPFs set out a shared vision for the kind of country we want to be, and it provides a platform for collaboration across Scotland's civic society, including public and private sectors, voluntary organisations, businesses and communities. And it's based on delivering outcomes that improve the quality of life for the people of Scotland. So again, I'm really struck by the similar values that are at the heart of the NPF: kindness, dignity and compassion, and they really reflect the values that you identified as an Assembly whenever you were thinking about the country that you wanted to build. And the reason we're revisiting this now is because the National Performance Framework, because of its importance in helping Scotland to become a more sustainable country. Now, it's clear working in partnership is critical to achieving both the National Performance Framework outcomes and also the Sustainable Development Goals. And actually, Goal 17 on those latter ones, the SDG, is devoted purely to that, because it's clear that no one organisation, including governments, national or local, can achieve these ambitions alone. And I'm sure you're thinking, oh, okay, this is all very admirable, but how far along are we in this journey to meet the 2030 UN targets? So the Scottish Government have carried out some research this year, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it shows that we're doing quite well on some targets, but not all. So to let you know, Scotland is performing well on water quality, on non-communicable disease mortality, on energy share from renewables, and on levels of young people who are in education and training. But we still face challenges, and these are around relative poverty, they're around healthy diet and obesity, they're around gender equality and the eradication of violence against women and girls. And I think it would be interesting for you to reflect within your own lived experience if those areas that we're not succeeding on at the moment chime with your experience individually and that of your community. So in Scotland, the SDG network helps coordinate Scotland's response to the Sustainable Development Challenges, and that kind of consists of over 300 members from across civil society, the public and private sector, and they work closely with the Scottish Government. And this is a pretty innovative approach to addressing the SDGs, and one which was progressed slightly further just last weekend, or sorry, not last weekend, last Thursday, when MSPs debated the On Target for 2030 report, which has been coordinated by Oxfam, the University of the West of Scotland, and the SDG Scotland Network. Now, if you're interested in this, and if you're interested on the outcome of that report and the debate, there are links to all that information on the member area of our website. And so finally, in a year when Glasgow will host the UN Climate Change Summit, the Scottish Government has announced that there will be a Climate Change Citizens' Assembly. And I think if the recommendations of our Assembly are falling within that climate change remit, and it strikes me that that is probably a strong likelihood, I would hope and aim for us to have some influence on the agenda for that Assembly going forwards. So I think at a basic level, sustainability can be seen as a call to action, a task in progress or a necessary journey that we can undertake together as a global community. And as such, it is both a political process, but also has the capacity to be a wider social process, one which we as citizens can take part in determining how we build our country. And it's clear that we, as the Citizens' Assembly, have a chance to have our say on what we would like to happen and how we would like to be involved in meeting those challenges, opportunities in the path to becoming more sustainable. So in that spirit, I'd like to introduce you to our three speakers, Sandy, directly to my left, Catherine in the middle, and Andy. And they're going to help us look in more detail at the sustainability challenge and how this can be overcome. I'm going to introduce them all in turn, if that's all right. Sandy Begbie will present his pitch to you on how we can become a more sustainable country by having full employment based on a growing and thriving economy. Sandy is the Chief Transformation Officer of Tesco Bank, and Sandy, you've received a CBE for your social mobility and inclusion leadership work. Okay, so thank you. Sandy, if you want to come up here and give us your pitch.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I guess at what's heart of what I'm going to talk about just for the next 10 minutes is that employment and employability is at the heart of creating an inclusive economy and at the heart of wealth creation. The IMF talk about the fact is that equal countries have much more sustainable growth as a result. And they then go on to define that success much broader than just simply GDP. They talk about the social and environmental impact, they talk about health, they talk about living standards, and they talk about housing. They also talk about employment. And what's really important, what's at the heart of what I'm going to talk about, is the issue about fair work. We have high levels of employment, but we also have high levels of in-work poverty. And that's simply because, as an economy, we simply don't have fair work at the heart of it. What does employment actually mean? Employment actually means lots of different things, because it's not just simply people doing a job to be rewarded. The benefits of employment are enormous, whether they're around about feeling included, around about health, mental health. There's lots of statistics around about the impact of employment on people's mental health. Also on things like, for example, obesity, which we've heard about, and the fact is that people have a purpose, on their well-being, on equality, confidence and self-esteem. People feel as though they have a value in society. So how can that be best achieved? I've long been involved in this whole area of employment, probably for the last 20 years. And I do think that fundamentally we need to think about how government, education, private sector and third sector develop an entirely new model in order to achieve full employment. At the moment, it seems to me that it's based on a loose collection of relationships with different objectives, different strategies that are not aligned, and therefore people driving to their own objectives. So in other words, the current model is not effective. And in talking to some third sector charities, I do a lot of work in third sector, people like Prince's Trust, Barnardo's, etc., who work with some of the most disadvantaged people in society. The reality is, in the UK generally, despite all the work that they do, we still have too high a percentage of people who are disengaged from society, and at the heart of that lies the fact is that if they are employed, it's not in fair work, and quite often they're not employed. So the challenges we face are, for example, child poverty. 1 in 6 in Scotland, 3 out of the last 4 years are defined as living in child poverty. Also, we have in-work poverty, where 2/3 of those in poverty are actually in-work households. How do we define fair work? Well, fair work is about secure, it's about being skilled, it's about being rewarded, it's about making sure that people continue to be employable and training, it's about fair terms, and it's about progression and opportunity for all, which is some of the themes that were picked up earlier. So employment for all must be the goal, I believe, in a sustainable Scotland. The opportunities that we've got are quite significant. I've long believed, and I was born and brought up in Scotland, I've worked overseas for a number of years, I've come back, I've strongly believed that Scotland has a number of things that are strengths that we do not yet fully leverage. One is our size. We have around about 5 million people. It's relatively easy to move around Scotland. You can get things done. We've got a relatively stable political environment compared to many other countries in the world. And you can actually manage to bring stakeholders together in the same room and actually try and get some clarity and alignment around that. So I think our size is a great opportunity. Secondly, linked to that, is really being clear about what our economy looks like in 10 years' time. We all know that fossil fuels are going to become a decreasing part of that economy. What's going to replace that? How are we going to create new industries, whether it's renewables, whether it's in the technology, whether it's in the biosciences space, etc. But having a really clear picture about what are the skills that we are going to need in the next 10 years, again, our size has is an opportunity to do that. But we do have challenges. I've referenced earlier the fact is that those 4 stakeholder groups, despite some best endeavours, have never really managed to crack the creation of a model to be effective, and with that goal of full employment. Funding. 99%, or just over 99% of our economy is driven in the private sector through SMEs. The tax regime needs to be used in a way that can actually help SMEs create opportunities. They should be encouraged to create employment, not discouraged. It costs us millions every year to keep people unemployed or to keep people in work poverty. We should be using that money to create a tax environment where SMEs in particular can actually then create job opportunities and take advantage of the sector growths that we will have in the next 5 to 10 years. Fair work for me means, at a minimum, it's a living wage, £8.21. In the UK, we've managed to overcomplicate this beyond belief. Regardless of age, regardless of any background issues, regardless of anything, people should get paid a living wage. We've got minimum wage, we've got different levels depending on age. It's overly complicated and completely unnecessary. And arguably, £8.21 isn't even close to being what a fair wage should be. But at a very minimum, we should be setting a target that every job in Scotland should be paid a living wage. Also, investors. Investors in companies can make a big difference. If, for example, they said that they were going to vote against things like their annual report, the remuneration report, and actually only vote for companies who do actually pay the living wage, who do actually treat their employees fairly, who do actually provide secure, good employment opportunities. So investing community has a role to play as well. And finally, and maybe slightly controversially, we are over-governed as a country. Between MPs, MSPs, local authorities, it is deeply complex, it is also costly, and actually trying to get a model, a scalable employment model in Scotland is unbelievably challenging. I set up the Developing Young Workforce in Edinburgh and the Lothians, and we made a lot of progress, but that was despite the fact that the model that was put in place was unbelievably complicated in order to satisfy individual preferences and agendas. I'll say a couple of words about the environment. I'm certainly no expert on this, but I just want to highlight some of the interesting challenges which will undoubtedly get picked up. I'm the chair of the Edinburgh International Film Festival, an international film festival, the longest running film festival in the world, and we attract a number of people from overseas. We have climate targets, we take the environment very seriously, and the government expects us to. But when a high percentage of your customers come from overseas and are going to fly, we're being challenged to both increase the impact of the festival, but to reduce our carbon footprint. That's deeply challenging for us, given that we are a charity, but secondly is actually how do we play one off against the other? I've also worked in businesses in Scotland all my life, many of which have had operations overseas. Export markets are a huge opportunity for Scotland, but that requires you getting on a plane to develop the opportunities that sit there. Again, how do organisations in Scotland who are looking to create jobs, but actually have high percentages of their business overseas, how do they square off the impact on the environment? I have no answers to that. As I say, I'm not an environment expert, but I just think it highlights some of the challenges. So some of the examples. When I was at Standard Life, we were involved in a partnership with Edinburgh City Council back in 2010 called the Edinburgh Guarantee. Over 500 young people left school in Edinburgh each year and ended up using the term they weren't in a positive destination, simply they were unemployed. That was entirely unacceptable, and we went about putting together an Edinburgh Guarantee programme underpinned by the living wage, and we got that number down to just over 100, so 80% reduction in the course of the following 3-4 years. Secondly is an example we worked with Prince's Trust, whereby we engaged the Prince's Trust working with SMEs, bringing young people together. And we as a co-organisation, we subsidised the SMEs to pay a living wage. Over 90% of those SMEs, when they came back to take a second young person, decided to pay a living wage themselves because they could see the value of having young people. So, in summary, the priorities, I believe, and my ask would be that we get education, private sectors, government and the third sector to work differently and commit to looking at a different leadership model that allows us to create a full employment, scalable model for the whole of Scotland. Finally, why is this really important to me? Because statistically, I shouldn't be standing in front of you. I come from an in-work poverty family. I went to one of the worst schools in Scotland. I have distinctly average educational qualifications. So the creation of employment for everyone and the opportunities is something that is really, really dear to my heart. And I don't see any reason why we can't do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Lots of food for thought there. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Catherine Trebeck, who will present her pitch to you on how we can become a more sustainable country by adopting a well-being economy approach, words that will be familiar to you from last week. Catherine co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland and is part of that global organisation. Thank you.
So I'm really, really excited to be speaking to you because I feel like I'm looking at Scotland. It's quite an honour to be speaking to an audience that is Scotland in miniature. So thank you very much for having me and for making time. This morning, when I was getting ready to come here, I was listening to Sajid Javid, the Chancellor. It's not something I do every morning, it's part of my morning routine. He was on the radio. And he was talking about how his ambition is to double the rate of growth for the UK. And even in our political panel this morning, we heard that we just need to have more economic growth. And so often we hear economic growth put up as an end in itself. If we're lucky, it's qualified a little bit and seen that if we have more growth, that will lead to good lives, to more jobs, to more environmental sustainability, often in the hope that if we grow the economy, it will trickle down miraculously to those who need it most. But whereas it may have been okay in the past to rely on that recipe, we can't do that in the future for 3 reasons. Firstly, because scientists are getting louder and more assertive about the role of economic growth in exacerbating and contributing to the environmental crisis that we face. And you've seen that in many pages of these massive scientific reports that have been coming out over the last few months. And you heard Greta, when she spoke to the UN last September, saying we cannot keep relying on these fairy tales of continuous economic growth. And we see students coming out of their classrooms every day, every Friday, saying enough of this political recalcitrance, relying on these old recipes to deliver good lives for people. We used to say we can just grow the pie and then we don't need to worry about how we share it. But now we're in a world where the oven is only so big. We need to talk about a fundamental restructure of our economic system. We cannot rely on technologies that are yet unproven or not yet invented to square that circle. We need to turn our attention to the nature of our economic system. So economic growth has proved unsafe because of the impact on the environment. The economic growth that we've had over the last few decades has been unevenly shared. And I know that you've seen that map of the Glasgow Tube map that illustrates the gaps in life expectancy. And I entirely agree with Sandy here that there's so many jobs are just not good enough in terms of how they pay, in terms of how they lift people out of poverty. People are not getting enough hours, so it's not just a case of how we pay people, but we can't keep treating people as on demand at the click of an app and then disposable when we no longer need them. We need to put dignity and purpose at the heart of our jobs and stop treating people as just-in-time inventory, the same way the restaurant that cooked our lunch would treat a carton of milk or a bag of rice. And in terms of wealth, we are a deeply uneven country. The 1% in Scotland have as much wealth as the poorest half of the Scottish population put together. Here in Clydebank, just around the corner, 1/3 of children are in poverty. And in the last few years, life expectancy for women in Clydebank has fallen by 2 years. So it's not okay just to educate people and help individuals become more employable. We need to turn our gaze to the structure of the economic system. So on top of the economic system being unsafe and being unevenly shared, it's also a sort of economic growth that is hurting us as communities. Because the choices that we make in the name of growth are doing so much harm to us as individuals. The sort of economic development we've got is not aligned with what local people want. We're putting time pressure on people. We're putting them in precarious situations where they don't feel they have control over their lives, over their incomes. And we're seeing increased levels of loneliness, alienation, and stress. So our growth is unsafe, it's unevenly shared, and it's hurting us. And the benefits that we may have had in the past are tailing off. No longer can we assume that growth is an automatic route to good lives or to good jobs or to environmental sustainability. And some big names have been saying this. The Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, the OECD, even the former head of the UK civil servant was at a conference I was at in the last few months, and he was telling the audience, why in rich countries do we keep hanging on to growth when the benefits are no longer apparent? In rich countries, actually, it's now time to have a conversation about, have we arrived? Have we got enough wealth and resources? And it's time to turn our attention to how we share them and how we cherish those wealth and resources. And that's a very, very different debate. Where we're up to at the moment is we've spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of political manoeuvring helping people cope with the damage of an unsafe, unevenly shared and hurtful economic system. So we need to have a different conversation and focus actually about building a well-being economy. This is one that puts social justice and a healthy environment at the forefront, and it ensures that the economy is in service of those needs rather than people and planet being in service of the economy. And if you think about what a well-being economy is about, you don't need to look far. You hear it in the texts of great religions, you hear it in so many songs, you see it if you look at brain scans of people what lights up, what makes us happy, what makes us content. I'd say most importantly, you hear it when you listen to deliberative conversations like this one here, when people are given the chance to stop and reflect on what most matters to them, what really matters to them. And it's not about having huge amounts of wealth or fancy cars or massive houses. It's about health, it's about sense of security, dignity, purpose, relationships, and a good local environment. And so how to get there? Well, it's a massive challenge because we can't shy away from the fact that we actually need to change our economic system. And so a couple of ways to do that are to shift our goals. Focus on goals that are much more aligned with what we as people and planet need. Change our new headline measures of progress, because that opens up the way for all the other sorts of shifts that we need. We need to rejig the tax system, and we talked about that a bit this morning in the political panel, so that it encourages the behaviours that we need as a community and disincentivises those that we don't. We need to ensure that the prices actually capture the full costs of what we're dealing with in social and environmental terms, so we're no longer seeing misleading signals that result in too much or too little investment in the sorts of goods and services that we require. We need to embrace business models that put goals of social and environmental purpose at the heart, because business is a key player in this, and already so many business organisations are asking questions about the nature of their ownership, how they're governed, what their very DNA of business is, so that they can pursue a greater purpose rather than just short-term profit. And we need to reform how money is created and how the finance system works, because so often we've got this huge amount of debt that puts pressure on families and puts pressure on government to grow the economy further. And we need to reposition finance as the plumbing of a new well-being economy. Now, this is extraordinarily difficult. Change is hard. People often default to the devil that they know. Better the devil they know, Kylie Minogue once sang. But do you know what? We can do better than that. And actually, we have to. Just because it's hard, we can't not go about this change. One of the young people that we work with, Sam, has said that to overcome the societal challenges that we face requires us to transform our economy. And then he said the climate crisis puts a clock on that. It gives us a decade to do so. And so he says the question that we face today is, will that change happen fast enough? And to get your head around the sort of shifts we need, you can just think about this idea of putting the actual cost of social and environmental impacts into the goods and services that we buy. Think about fair trade chocolate, or imagine if we actually priced the environmental harm of shipping pineapples into Scotland. If we put all the costs of the shipping and the transport costs into the price of a pineapple, you can start to get a sense of the layers and the ripple effects of these sorts of shifts. So this might make some items unaffordable, which might be a good thing if it's chocolate. Maybe it's a bad thing if it's something healthy like pineapples. But then again, that might push us to turn our attention to locally grown goods and services that would then create local jobs. So that would be a good thing. Maybe it might exacerbate inequalities in terms of who can afford to buy what. But then we might start reinventing different business models and get more creative, and so we can provide for ourselves locally. But actually, if you think about it, if we're scared to do something that's sustainable just because some consumers can't afford to buy it, doesn't mean that's a reason not to do it. It means actually that we've got a much bigger job ahead of us. We need to make sure that all consumers have enough income so they have the right choices. And that is a much wider conversation. That's about distribution. So in other words, Scotland, if it's going to have a hope of being a socially just, sustainable country, can't stay in the territory of sticking plaster and retrofitting and just being content to heal and fix and patch up after we've created so much damage to people and planet. We need to redesign our economy so that it gets things right first time round. redesign our economy so it's a wellbeing economy in direct service of what you have identified as the goal for Scotland, socially just and sustainable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine, for clearly articulating some of the challenges. I'd now like to ask Dr. Andy Kerr to present his pitch on how we can become a more sustainable country by delivering Scotland's climate change targets. Andy is the UK and Ireland Director for EIT Climate KIC, Europe's largest innovation agency for climate solutions, which works with cities, industries, regions to deliver transformational change. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, and a very good afternoon to you all. It's a real pleasure to be here. You'll have been talking a fair bit about climate change, listening to some of the conversations from the political panel this morning. What I want to do is talk a little bit about delivering Scotland's climate change targets. And as you will appreciate, Scotland has chosen to position itself as one of the global leaders in tackling climate change. And by tackling climate change, I mean both how we manage, how we build resilience against the impacts of climate change, like flooding, storms and the like, but also then how we start to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which doesn't just affect us, it affects people around the world. And we are widely recognised as a country that is a leader in this space. So my pitch today is very much that by delivering on these ambitious climate targets that we have in Scotland, we can actually also deliver a whole series of social and economic benefits that we've been hearing about in the last few minutes. So what today is not about is whether climate change is happening, and what it's not about is whether we should act. That decision has already been taken. Scottish Parliament has already set ambitious targets on a cross-party basis. So the issue facing us now is how do we deliver against our ambitious targets? And for Scotland, those ambitious targets are around the jargon being net carbon, net zero, i.e. we have no net impact on the climate system by 2045, 25 years away. And an expectation that we'll be 3/4 of the way there, so 75% emission reductions by 2030. That's 10 years away. That is a phenomenal ask of any country, and it's one of the leading sort of targets around the world. The choices of how we meet these targets is constrained by who holds what levers of power. Where does the power sit? International, national governments, local governments, communities. It depends on the access to resources, who has the skills, the talent, the funding, the money to deliver some of this stuff. But it also depends on the collective decisions by us as individuals and our communities as to whether we really want to go down this route. Because we can actually help, enable, or we can hinder, we can slow down and stop. It's difficult to overstate how big a change we are expecting to see over the next 10, 15, 20 years in terms of our housing, our transport, our mobility, our land use, to deliver these climate impacts, both here in Scotland but also internationally. And they're going to have a major impact on jobs, on our businesses, on our homes, our communities, our towns, our cities. What's going to happen in the future? We're going to see radical changes, radical improvements, we hope, to the fabric of our buildings, our houses, our homes, our businesses. We're going to see a complete change in how you heat our homes to try and get away from using natural gas. We're going to see the complete replacement of diesel and petrol vehicles, cars, vans, buses, lorries, with electric cars, perhaps with hydrogen, over the next 10, 15 years. You're going to see major changes in land use, as, for example, we put more trees into the landscape, and big changes in key sectors like the oil and gas sector. So for today, what I want to do is just take one of those many changes that we're anticipating that are being put in train, and just get you thinking about some of the trade-offs, some of the opportunities, some of the challenges. And I want to focus on homes, the buildings we live in. So over the next 10 years, we're trying to improve the fabric of pretty much every home in the country. And the reason we want to do that is we're trying to reduce the amount of gas that we use to heat the homes. So on the one hand, we need to improve the fabric of the homes, and then later we're going to then try and replace the gas with other things, heat pumps, district heating. Some people are talking about using hydrogen in the gas network. But actually, let's just focus on the fabric of the homes. Can this be done? Can we improve every home in the country in 10 years? Technically, yes, we can. But what are the challenges? We're talking about massive upfront costs. It's going to cost billions of pounds to do that. Overall, over the next 10, 15, 20 years, we'll actually probably save money, because actually we're going to be reducing what we pay for what we heat the homes with. You know? So the overall cost may go down, but the upfront cost is going to be high. Who's going to pay for that? Should we be taxing people so the government spends more money in this space? How do we persuade people who can afford to pay to actually invest in their own homes? How do we force landlords to invest in their buildings so that tenants have lower energy costs? So these are the sorts of questions that we're facing. We're also going to have a lot of upheaval in terms of completely restructuring or rebuilding quite a few homes. We've had experiences in the past where even where people are being given free insulation, where people are being paid and being given free insulation, they've chosen to say, no, thanks very much, don't want the upheaval, prefer spending lots on our energy bills, we just don't want to have a big mess in our home. So the question then is, how do we persuade people in that space? So if that's the challenges, what are some of the opportunities? Actually, over 10 or 20 years, we should largely remove things like fuel poverty, where people are spending 10, 20% of their total household income just trying to stay warm. Because if you've got highly efficient buildings and you've got much lower energy costs, we should find ways of reducing fuel poverty, which is a real blight in Scotland. We should be delivering a whole bunch of jobs and skills, because we're talking about putting infrastructure investments right the way across the country, in every city, town and village across the country. We should be reducing dependence on things like imported gas from places like the Middle East, which is what we'll be relying on increasingly otherwise. So there are a series of opportunities that are coming on that, but the trade-offs will include the sort of disruption. If you're putting in heat pumps, if you're putting in city centres or town centres, district heating, we're talking about an awful lot of roads being dug up. So there's going to be short-term costs, short-term disruption. But actually the overall benefit going forward should be healthier, because you're not living in cold, damp accommodation. So health, wealth, well-being are amongst those things of having warm, affordable homes in 20, 25 years' time. So those are the sorts of challenges that we're faced for each of the, for the practical challenges of hitting climate targets. But the issue is not just about delivering climate targets. The issue is also going to be, how do we ensure that Scotland undergoes a fair or a just transition? And picking up some of what we've heard from Sandy and from Catherine, how do we ensure that if we're going to put people in to redevelop homes, that actually we're making sure that the skills and the jobs are going to people across Scotland? How do we ensure that we're recycling money that's being invested in Scotland and that stays in Scotland? So those sorts of issues, are absolutely key to whether we're going to deliver this or not. So my position today is very much that if we meet climate targets, if we do it right, then actually we're going to deliver a whole series of other social and economic co-benefits across the country. My final point is just around that national climate ambitions, whether they're Scottish, whether they're UK, cannot be delivered by national governments. They're a function of what happens internationally, they're a function of what happens in global markets, global supply chains, they're a function of what happens at UK level, EU level, they're a function of what happens at Scottish level, but also what cities are choosing to do, what local communities are choosing to do. So after Brexit, a lot of our legislation, which things like efficiency of homes, efficiency of vehicles, were set at European level. A lot of that will now fall at UK level. If the UK is aligned with what Scotland is trying to do, that's fine. If we're trying to divert and go further forward, there is a challenge. So we need to think about, again, where the levers of power lie. And the other thing is that if we're going to deliver this sort of change, then the sort of thing that Glasgow are doing, that Edinburgh are doing as a city, which is to go further and faster than at a national level, then we need to make sure the powers sit there in terms of planning, procurement. Yeah? So these issues around where does the power sit, how do we get the resources in, are absolutely key. So I'll just finish by saying we've got ambitious climate targets. We can achieve them, but the choices we make collectively are going to be about, do we want to make them in a way that delivers these wider social and economic benefits? Or do we just want to make sure that we've met the climate targets and worried about the environment and not other things? And those are the choices that we need to make as a society, as a country, over the next couple of years. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much to Andy, Catherine and Sandy. Now, all three of our speakers this afternoon will be visiting the rooms that you're in for your deliberations, so there will be an opportunity to raise questions if by chance we don't get to cover the questions that you have just now. So I'm just wondering if, based on all that very rich information and propositions and trade-offs, we've got about 25 minutes now to take questions and really unpack some of the issues that our speakers were presenting there. Would anybody? I have got one I've prepared earlier. If anybody doesn't come forward with a question, but any direct questions from the floor? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Just before we do that, if you want to have a quick kind of check-in with your neighbour. Just to kind of check out your questions, see if there's any commonalities. We'll do that for a minute first, and then I've got prepared one, but hopefully there'll be questions coming from the floor. I get the sense from the lively debate that there is a lot of questioning bubbling up in the audience. Now, you'll know from this morning that we may not get the opportunity to go through every question in this format, but we will try and find a system to get any questions answered. Okay, so is there anybody from this side of the room who wants to go on ahead? We've got one question to the left.
It's about the climate changes. It was just on the news this morning that 25% of their carbon footprint comes from fresh water, such as lochs, lakes, and rivers. How do we solve that problem?
So when we're talking about the natural environment, there are flows of emissions from land use, from peatlands. What we can do is we can't say we're trying to stop all of those emissions. What we try and find is a net. So we try and find ways in which we can sequester, so draw in carbon dioxide to the same value, same amount as that is being emitted. So, for example, in Scotland, we have very high tree planting targets. It was 10,000 hectares a year of new afforestation. It's up at 15 or more. And the aim is then to try and balance the fact that there will be greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, from soils, and from lakes and from fresh water. So you're not trying to say we're going to stop every single element. What you're trying to say is, can we find a balance between areas where you can draw it down naturally or artificially in future, and what is going to get emitted naturally or because of our actions.
Okay. Yep. We have another question from this side of the room.
Hi there. It was a question about electric cars. So they are quite expensive, but they're limited to how far you can go in them and obviously run them as well. I mean, ideally, when you mentioned, the next 10 years, we're looking for people to probably not use petrol and diesel. But as I just says, the cost of them and the limitations, what is your thoughts for someone just on an average wage?
So I'm also going to try and draw in actually a couple of the other things that have been said here, because You're right, electric cars are expensive. We're getting to the point, we're very close to the point where actually the total cost of ownership, so when you've got the electric car plus the charging, is getting to the point where it is cheaper than buying a car and using petrol or diesel. We're not quite there yet. But we are starting to see all of the major manufacturers coming out with new models. So, for example, Volkswagen are trying to bring their new e-Golf out later this year at exactly the same price point as their current petrol Golf. So we're going to see, we're on the cusp of a massive change globally from the supply chains. That's not being driven by Scotland, that's being driven by much bigger market changes around the world. But the aim is, how do we get to the point where essentially car ownership is cheaper? Yeah? And there are different ways we can do that. And we can also rethink whether we actually want to all own a car that sits essentially in one place for 22, 23 hours a day, and whether we're going to use more ride sharing, whether we're going to use different forms of mobility to get people around in and around cities. And that's also where actually the whole business of the skills, the capabilities, how do we invest in our communities to ensure that people have the mobility they need without having a large sum of money to buy a car up front and then sit it in their garage or on the street for many hours a day. So actually rethinking how we do it is a bigger issue, but we are getting to the point that electric cars will be cheaper overall to run than our existing cars.
Yeah. Catherine or Sandy, comments on transport?
Yeah, so I think the question has to be going beyond car ownership being cheaper to actually making public transport much better, and not being content just to fix the sort of old current model and retrofit it a little bit, but actually really transform how we think about mobility. The mayor of Bogota apparently once said that a rich country, a developed country, a successful country is not one where the poor drive cars, but where the rich ride the buses. And if we can really get ambitious with the quality, the accessibility, the safety of our transport, and particularly ensuring, people in rural areas feel connected and that they're relevant for jobs as well, they're not just, one a day, I mean, that's not going to help anyone, then we're into the sort of conversation that I think we need. So we've got to really raise our ambitions beyond just sort of making what we've got a little bit cooler, a little bit more sustainable, a little bit zingier, and actually repackage how we go about society and work.
Sandy, any comments?
Not particularly on that, but one thing I would say is, you're right, and you talk about an asset that people own is pretty much sits on the driveway or at work for 22 hours a day. I think one thing that's been interesting about the development of the gig economy, and I'm not making a view as to whether it's good or bad, is that actually the gig economy has allowed people to take an asset, whether it's their time, their vehicle, their bike, their knowledge or whatever, and actually leverage their own return from that. So, at the end of the day, people have got cars, people have chosen to use that car as a way of generating further income and revenue on the back of it in a way that works for them. As I say, there are lots of organisations who treat their workers very poorly in that space, and that's a separate issue. But the thing is that people are increasingly using that what I would say is underutilised assets. Airbnb is another one, whereby people are saying, how can I generate a revenue out of an asset that I've invested in? So.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take some questions over from the left-hand side of the room, and then I'll come into the middle. So I think there's one hand, two.
Sandy, sorry, one to Sandy and Catherine. You spoke quite emotively about how we don't really have a sort of workers' cooperative in this country now. Most workers now, I hope we're not talking, don't feel engaged in their employment with their employer and part of the whole bigger economic circle. It's where we have CEO, EOs making, hundreds of millions now, while 60% of your workforce is still only on maybe below the living wage, and hell and be damned and be grateful for it. How do we address that? It's a big question, but even the cultural mindset. I remember from my parents' age going to work, they loved their work, they loved their work colleagues. Now what we do, as you say, from the gig economy, we pit workers against one another, get as many hours as you can, don't even care about your fellow workers. I can remember cooperative societies. Yeah.
Can I just, we're going to try and keep things as punchy as possible. Are there any other questions that kind of relate to that broad area? One at the back there.
Thank you. I wonder what the panel feel about nationalising the land that we sit on, about the energy that we use, and about the banks and food that we all need.
Okay, so we'll deal with those. So cooperative approaches to employment, and then the land of the nation.
So I think I completely agree. Organisations, and certainly two of the organisations I've worked in, have had high levels of employee engagement and also had mechanisms internally to distribute wealth in a much broader way. And we all know about companies like John Lewis, for example, where people share in the profits and the value that's created. I'm a massive advocate for that. And I think that organisations who do that see the benefit of retention, people feeling as though they're much more engaged in the workplace. And the things like trade unions, and whether it's unions or it's employee recognition groups, whatever, they're a massively important part of how it is. The whole issue about executive remuneration has completely got out of control. There's obviously people who are highlighted specifically in that space, and I think that that's completely wrong. But I think the sharing of wealth internally and wealth creation is absolutely key to what I would say is a sustainable business. And there are lots of organisations that do that. They just don't grab the headlines. But I think that it is really, really important that people feel as though they own it. I think also locally, I think you will find, as well as organisations need to find a way in which they can bring similar type of organisations together. To your point about how do they share resources, how do they share best practice, how do they think about the environmental impact, etc., etc. So there's a lot more we could do in individual sectors, undoubtedly.
So absolutely everything that Sandy said, so underline it, tick it, it's absolutely bang on. And just to add to that, the benefits of cooperative business models just keep going and going and going. They have so many ripple effects, because these are businesses that are set up with a different purpose. They are set up to deliver benefits to their membership, which means their workers, or it might mean local community owners, or it might be their customers or producers. There are all sorts of different iterations of the cooperative model. But to give you an example of how they're good for society as well, there's a study that's been done in the north of Italy where there's a huge percentage of cooperatives in the local economy. And a scholar, who's a Scottish guy actually, a guy called David Erdell, and he looked at one town that's got loads of cooperatives in the local economy, and then he compared it to a town a few miles up the road that had a sort of average, lower level of cooperatives. And the co-op town, as he called it, higher levels of voting, higher levels of education, higher levels of blood donation. I mean, what better example of sort of pure altruism can you get? It sort of creates better communities if people feel in control, if they feel they're contributing, if they feel they're listened to. So to me, a wellbeing economy is one that's got a much higher percentage of cooperatives as part of the economic ecosystem as compared to the current one we've got. In terms of the second question, in terms of national ownership, I think it depends on the sector. And I think it depends on the technologies and scales in the sector, depending on whether it's going to be suitable or not. I think, though, I'd be wary of a binary between private and nationalisation, because I think that's a false division that misses the very beautiful opportunity of community ownership. And think about, we heard this morning a little bit in the political discussion about locally owned banks, but also locally owned energy is one of the most exciting transformations that we could have, that to, one, bring down environmental costs, control the design of local energy regeneration, and ensure that those benefits go first and foremost to the communities that are most impacted. So it's not an either or. To me, it might be nationalisation, government owned, maybe it's cities, or maybe it's a nation state owned. Maybe it's delivered by the private sector with the appropriate regulations in place to make sure it's not just exploiting a natural monopoly, or maybe it's community ownership. And I think we've got to get away, I guess, from the sort of black and white discussion that we had, I'd say, during the last election about nationalisation.
Just one thing I would add, just going back to the first question. When we underpinned everything in 2010 with the living wage, we immediately built it into our supply chain. So we said every single supplier that had anyone on site in Standard Life needed to pay a living wage. And the cleaning companies and the caterers and all the rest of it said, we can't do that. And we said, no, actually, we will subsidise it. Large organisations have got a big role to play. And then they need to say to the investors, you know what, we're going to actually fund our supply chain to get them moving on this journey. And that's what we did. And then after a couple of years, they actually said, you know what, we can see the benefits of paying a living wage because we've got better retention, we retain better people, and actually we'll do it ourselves. So you've got to take a stance on some of these things to actually drive some change.
Thank you. Okay, we haven't had any questions from the middle of the room. Is there anybody who would like to pose a question? Thank you.
It's actually a couple of questions. Will they making the houses more fabrication, more economical? Will it make the resale value be better if the people have to pay that themselves? Excuse me. And only people at the moment on benefits qualify for getting their houses upgraded.
Yeah, and this I mean, both those, in terms of the resale value, Britain's one of the weird countries, if you look across Europe, where there isn't a particularly good relationship between house price and quality of the fabric of the home. And so there is actually quite a lot of attempts at the moment at an investor level in terms of saying, if you're going to be, you know, so if you're talking about house owners and somebody is getting a mortgage, can we ensure the mortgage actually captures the cost of the energy as well, so that you can start to look at the total cost of running the home rather than just the home itself? Because we do have this problem in terms of there's a mismatch between our house prices and the quality of the homes that we've got. So that's something that is being worked on at the moment. In terms of the second issue, this really comes back to how do we start to look not just at, you know, we've got people on benefits who may get support for their homes, but how do we look across every single home in the country and start to say, how do we get all of them to come up to a certain standard in terms of the quality of that home, in terms of the quality of the energy efficiency? And that's something that different people are looking at different ways we can do it. But the question still comes back to who pays for it. And that's not been resolved yet. You know, we can try and persuade people who are quite wealthy, say when they move house, to get forced to upgrade the house just to the point where they move house, for example. You can persuade social landlords to do it through regulation. There are different ways you can do it, but at the end of the day, we're trying to move beyond only supporting one small group to do it, to say how do we get it across the whole of the society? And there aren't any easy answers to that, and that's something that we're still, you know, local authorities, national government, housing associations are all grappling with. How do we do this in a way that is affordable and acceptable cost to people going forward?
I would just add one thing. I think personally, I think tax is used in the UK as quite a blunt instrument. And I think, to Andy's point, I think we need to think about cleverly about how we use it to encourage and then also penalise those who don't. So I'm not saying this is a thought-through idea, but you talk about the fact is that, you know, if people have the money to pay, then actually they should be, if they do not upgrade their houses, then they should be penalised, whether through council tax or whatever vehicle it happens to be. If they choose not to, then there should be penalised in the back of it. Likewise, if they do, then there's some encouragement for that to happen. So I think we need to think, and my point about the tax and jobs is about how do we encourage SMEs to create jobs by actually reducing the tax burden on them if they create employment opportunities. But as the flip side of that is if people choose not to, then actually they may end up paying more tax. So we need to try and think cleverly about how we use tax to drive some of that behavioural change.
Catherine, I just want to note that you've got three very, very different speakers up here who all of us have said utilise the tax system much more ambitiously in incentivising the sort of behaviours that are aligned with what Scotland needs and disincentivising the sort of behaviours, whether that's type of employment, whether that's environmental behaviours. So if you need a clear message about one of the ambitions or one of the asks or one of the ideas that you should take, the fact that you've got three very different people from very different sectors coalescing around a message there, that's a pretty good endorsement of something that you can take forward and feel you're on pretty safe ground with, I think.
Thank you, Catherine. And we've got a question at the back and then one at the front, and then we'll pause for...
Sustainability is quite a big word. I just wanted to ask if it was devolved or if it was reserved. I know there'll be certain aspects of it, probably. but we're going backwards here, where there are incentives, encouraging people. They were given incentives, solar panels, renewable heat source cars. And now these incentives are going back the way. And I just wondered, is that UK or is it Scottish? You know, because if it's this country or not.
Can I just check, is the question at the front related to that or completely different?
It's about wealth distribution.
Wealth distribution, okay. Let's just have a quick question to the devolved.
So a lot of the climate change stuff, the environment stuff is devolved to Scotland. But a lot of issues like energy, which is at the heart of how you change Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions, is mostly reserved. So Scotland has the right to promote renewables, to promote energy efficiency, but many of the levers that it needs around energy and energy policy are reserved. So it's a really complicated mix, and it's a complicated mix because traditionally, actually the European level is the one that has been driving a lot of behaviours like renewable targets in European countries. So it's a really complicated mix between what was the EU, the UK and Scotland. So it's not entirely straightforward, and obviously with the election, with Brexit, there is going to be a need to reset a lot of that and to have a rethink. But that is going to be a challenge where powers are held at UK level where they are choosing not to align with Scotland's ambitions.
Yeah. And Andy, we can get into more detail of that in the rooms as we go along with particular contexts. So there's a question at the front and then one from the side, which I think we'll have to finish off on.
So I wanted to ask, what are the ideas or incentives or frameworks discussed about the wealth distribution among the 1% or really wealthy companies, individuals, and the ones that are probably in works or maybe more realistic to achieve?
So yeah, any ideas that are already existing within that 1%?
Well, firstly, it's very hard to get data about the 1% because of the nature of their wealth is not actually usually by income; it's by rent, so-called rents that they make through their wealth. So we don't know enough about them, which hampers policy prescriptions. But I think, more and more people now are talking about a wealth tax. But also I think there's incentives around, I think Sandy spoke about this a little bit, about how we design the value share within a firm. How do we distribute the money that is created by everyone in a workplace? And worker cooperatives are another really, really good example. If everyone is actually the owner of that company, you won't have a few people who are owning it getting all the benefit. You'll have everyone owning it or sharing in the benefit. And so really redesigning businesses is a really, really important lever. Again, I think that tax is just such an important way. At the moment we tax the work that we'll all do in our day jobs more heavily than we tax the money that people make for the very fact that they make money, that they have money. So in a way, their wealth will make more money for them than we can make earning. Does that make sense? So it's their wealth, the cream that comes from their wealth through rents, through interest payments, through dividends and share payments and so on. And that's crazy because we talked about how work is such an important thing. It's such an important part of people's lives, of their identity, of their sense of purpose. And yet we've got a tax system that basically to small businesses disencourages them taking on more workers. So we've got that. Tax is, again, a huge lever.
Thank you, Catherine. We're going to take one last question from the right and then wrap up the session.
Yes, the panel said public transport should be used wherever possible. But the fact of the matter is the fares are going up. Train fares, bus fares will be going up next month. So if it's more economical to use your own your own private transport than to use the public one.
Okay, so cost against.
I'll start. So, this is an example of the sort of thing I was talking about at the end, how the prices of what we face as consumers don't reflect the full environmental harm or perhaps the social benefit of a particular activity, and nowhere is this more clear as in the contrast between rail and airfares. So it is it'll be massively cheaper for all of us. If we wanted to go to London, all of us, 100 or so people, let's go down to London for a weekend away together. It'll be so much cheaper in our hip pocket if we just flew. But in terms of the environmental impact, we don't see that when we click onto whatever airline is left to take that price. And so we've seen this distorting impact of the prices not capturing the full environmental cost, which will come back to bite us. And I'm Australian, so I don't need to tell you the harmful impact of us not taking the environmental crisis seriously. It will come back to hurt all of us, and it already is in Scotland. Last year, Scotland had grass fires in the middle of February. I mean, so it's already happening now. We saw the video of of Uist. South Uist is already seeing the sea level come up now. Crofters are seeing sea level encroach on their crofting farms. So it is not a million miles away. It's not a million years away. It's happening now. And so this false pricing that makes us choose the wrong thing. But then again, as I said, we also need to attend to the distributional impacts of that and make sure that everyone has enough money to make the right choices.
Okay, Andy, a quick...
Yeah, I think it's worth saying, because you're quite right, there is a challenge there, but what we are starting to see are places, so, in Edinburgh, they're talking about a city centre transformation, which is about saying, how do you create a city that is actually designed around people, not around just allowing people to drive in wherever? And that means, therefore, okay, we need to cut down on the number of cars in the city centre, but you then need to make sure that there is the transport available to make it at an affordable cost. So we are starting to see cities, towns actually starting to address this and say people need to be at the heart of what we do going forward. And when you start to see that, then you can start to pull out some of these cost problems and start to deal with them.
Okay, thank you. And Sandy, a couple of final words?
I just think, I think, not to repeat what's been said, I think I'm quite close to the Edinburgh redevelopment. I think that, councils, politicians just need to make some hard choices, but they are driven by this whole thing about being re-elected. The bottom line is Edinburgh, Glasgow, etc. could have made a lot of these decisions years ago. And they've played about and fiddled about and everything else. And, people just need to get on and make the right choices and accept that actually at times there will be a group of people that will not like it. But the reality is that actually taking cars out of the city centre has made sense today as it made sense 10 years ago. People just need to go on and make the right choices and make the right decisions.
Okay, thank you, Sandy. I think that's the perfect time for us to close just now. We're going to go away and deliberate and see how we can assist with making those hard choices. As I said before, this panel system is slightly inefficient in that every question does not get answered, but happily Andy and Catherine are able to stay with us and we'll be working around the rooms when you're deliberating. Sandy unfortunately has to leave for personal reasons, but has agreed to answer questions in another format as they come in. So can I just say thank you so much to all our panels. And I believe you are now having a coffee break. Oh, no, Kelly is the lady who knows.
You are having a break. Absolutely having a break. If you could please be in your breakout rooms for 4:15, so 4:15. But yeah, please go get teas, coffees, and have a well-deserved break. Thank you.